They stripped her of her voice, her title, her name, and thought that made her powerless. They were wrong. This is the story of a woman who walked into the most dangerous palace in the world with nothing but silence and a secret that could bring empires to their knees. Stay with me until the very end because every single scene matters. Hit that like button, subscribe so you never miss a story like this, and drop your city in the comments right now. Tell me where you're watching from. My storytelling tribe is everywhere, and I want to know you're here. The auction block was built from salvaged timber and old shame. It stood in the center of Varick Square, a wide stretch of packed stone in the merchant district of Thalvane City, and on the morning of the Crimson Autumn Festival, it smelled exactly like what it was, a place where human lives got assigned prices. Torch smoke drifted in from the east quarter. Somewhere behind the crowd, a vendor was selling spiced meat off an iron skewer, and the fat dripped onto hot coals and popped and hissed while men in fine coats sipped black wine from handled cups and waited for the entertainment to begin. Lord Henrath Cassin stood at the front of that crowd and could not stop smiling. He was a man who smiled the way a wound festers, slowly and with increasing damage. 43 years old, broad across the chest from decades of eating well, with gray threading through his dark beard and rings on 4 fingers of each hand. He served as auction commissioner for the Noctaran Western Territories, a title that meant nothing in a war council but everything in a square like this one. Here, Henrath Cassin was the closest thing to a god that most of the people on that platform would ever encounter. He unrolled the parchment in his hands and cleared his throat. "Lot 7, he announced, and his voice carried the particular flatness of a man who had done this so many times that the faces had stopped registering as faces. Female, approximate age 22 to 24 years, captured from the ruins of the Ashcroft territory following the Battle of Silvermarsh, physically intact, medically assessed as healthy, no documented combat capability." He paused for effect, the way a man pauses when he knows the next line is the one that closes the deal. Mute, incapable of speech, compliant by nature. The crowd murmured, not with sympathy, with calculation. A mute servant was a specific kind of valuable. They couldn't organize. They couldn't whisper secrets to other servants. They couldn't tell a story to the wrong person at the wrong time. They were the closest thing a nervous noble could buy to a guaranteed silence. And in the courts of Noctara, silence was worth more than gold on most days. Celine Ashcroft walked onto the platform and looked out at the crowd looking at her. She was not what most of them expected, which was its own kind of advantage. She was lean rather than imposing. Her dark hair cut short in a ragged way that suggested utility over vanity. Her hands were calloused across the palm and the outer edge of the thumb, the particular callous pattern of someone who held a weapon often and held it hard. The tunic they'd put her in was gray and ill-fitting, and the hemline hit her mid-shin, and her feet were bare on the cold timber of the platform, and she did not shift her weight or look down or wrap her arms around herself the way the others had. She stood still. Her eyes moved across the crowd with a specific quality, not scanning for a friendly face, not calculating an escape route, though she had already noted both. The quality her gaze carried was assessment. She was reading the crowd the way a general reads a map before a siege. Who stood close? Who stood apart? Who kept their hands relaxed? And who held their cups too tight? Who was genuinely here to buy, and who was here because somebody else told them to come? In the third row, slightly to the left of center, a man in a black riding coat stood alone. He was not holding a cup. His hands were at his sides, and his eyes were fixed on the platform, and the men standing nearest to him were maintaining a particular kind of distance, not the polite distance of strangers, but the loaded distance of men who understand that proximity to this specific person carries consequences. He was not the largest man in the square, though he was large. He was not the most visibly armed, though there were weapons at his hip and at his back, and almost certainly at his ankle. What he was, beyond all other physical facts, was still in a way that living creatures rarely managed. The crowd moved around him the way water moves around stone. He did not move at all. Raiden Drukhar watched her the way he watched most things, like a problem he hadn't solved yet. He had not planned to attend an auction this morning. He had planned to review the border dispatch that arrived yesterday from General Torvek, which outlined in considerable detail the military situation developing on Noctara's northern border, and he had planned to meet with his treasury minister about the shortfall in the Eastern Province tax collection. And he had planned to eat something before midday for the first time in 3 days because his body was starting to remind him, with increasing insistence, that it was not actually made of iron, regardless of what the songs claimed. Instead, he was standing in a market square in Thalvan City because his senior intelligence officer, a meticulous man named Cray Dawson, had sent a 4-word note at dawn. The note said, "You need to come." Dawson was not a man who sent unnecessary messages. In 11 years of service, he had sent unnecessary messages exactly 0 times, and Raiden had learned to treat his communications the way a soldier treats a signal fire. If it's lit, something is already burning. So Raiden had come. He had arrived without fanfare, which was not unusual for him. The stories that circulated about the Alpha King of Noctara depicted a man who entered rooms the way thunderstorms entered valleys, loudly, with attendance and ceremony and the full weight of dominance performed for everyone watching. Those stories were not entirely false. Raiden understood the strategic value of spectacle. He deployed it with precision when precision was what the moment called for. What the stories missed, because stories always simplified in the direction of drama, was that he was equally capable of walking through a crowd completely unrecognized when recognition would cost him information he needed. Today he needed information. He watched the woman on the platform and felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Uncertainty. Not about whether to buy her. Dawson's information on that point was unambiguous, and Raiden did not second-guess information that came through channels he trusted. The uncertainty was more specific. It was the uncertainty of a man who has spent decades building a precise model of how the world works, and has just encountered a variable that doesn't fit the model. She was a servant at auction. She stood on that platform like she was reviewing troops. Those 2 facts were not compatible, and incompatible facts in Raiden's experience were almost always the most important facts in any given situation. Henrath Kassin began taking bids. The number climbed in small increments the way bids climbed when no one in the crowd was seriously motivated. A cloth merchant offered 40 silver. A minor noble from the Grenvale district raised it to 55. A fat man in the back, whose name Raiden didn't know, went to 62 and looked very pleased with himself. 100 gold, Raiden said. The square went quiet with the particular quality of silence that falls when an outcome has just been decided. Henrath Kassin's smile did not change, but something moved behind his eyes. A quick recalculation, a brief moment of recognition. He had been doing this long enough to identify the quality of that voice. Not loud, not aggressive. The voice of a man who named the price that ended the conversation, not because he couldn't have gone higher, but because he saw no reason to negotiate the end of something that was already over. 100 gold, Kassin repeated carefully. Do I hear 100 and— You don't, Raiden said. He heard muffled laughter from somewhere behind him. His own men, stationed throughout the crowd in positions that were designed to look casual and weren't. The fat man in the back set his cup down with a small, defeated click. Nobody bid again. Celine Ashcroft was escorted off the platform by one of Kassin's handlers, a thick-necked man with a proprietary grip on her upper arm, who was steering her toward the payment table. She walked where he directed her. Her expression did not change. Her eyes moved once, briefly, to find the man who had just purchased her, and when they found him, the assessment in them shifted slightly. Not surprise exactly, but a recalibration. Something was being filed and stored. Raiden met her gaze across the square. He held it for exactly 2 seconds. Then he turned away to find Dawson, because he had work to do, and because holding the gaze of a freshly purchased servant for longer than 2 seconds was the kind of behavior that generated the wrong kind of questions. Cray Dawson was waiting near the east gate with a horse and a look on his face that meant the situation was worse than the note had implied. He was a thin man, Dawson, with the narrow shoulders and ink-stained fingers of a scholar and the flat, watchful eyes of something that hunted at night. He had served Raiden since before Raiden took the throne, through the Succession War and the Northern campaigns, and the 12 separate assassination attempts that Raiden knew about, plus the 3 that Raiden was fairly certain Dawson had simply never told him about, on the grounds that they had been resolved before becoming relevant. He was the most loyal man in Raiden's service, and also the most consistently irritating, which was a combination Raiden had learned to respect. Talk, Raiden said. Not here. Dawson handed him the horse's reins and fell into step alongside him as they moved away from the market crowd. He kept his voice low and his eyes moving. 2 nights ago, a courier was intercepted on the Halvern Road, riding hard from the Western Pass, no insignia, ciphered documents and a false bottom on the saddlebag. What documents? Correspondence between House Velerin and the Mirath Alliance. Dosan paused. Detailed correspondence, troop commitments, timeline, supply route negotiations. Raiden's jaw tightened. House Velerin was one of the 6 noble houses that sat on the Grand Council. Lord Edric Velerin had personally stood in Raiden's throne room 6 months ago and delivered a formal declaration of loyalty on behalf of his house and every holding within its territories. How detailed, Raiden said. Specific enough to constitute a war plan. The 2 of them walked for a moment in silence that was doing a lot of work. The girl, Raiden said. The Ashcroft territory fell in the Battle of Silvermarsh 11 months ago. The official record says it was a straightforward conquest. Ashcroft militia force, poorly organized, overwhelmed by superior numbers. Lord Commander Tashin filed the report personally and unofficially. Dawson reached into his coat and produced a folded sheet of paper. He handed it without looking at it, still watching the street. My source inside the Silvermarsh garrison wrote this 3 weeks before she disappeared. Raiden unfolded the paper. The handwriting was cramped and careful, the writing of someone who understood that what they were putting on paper could get them killed. He read it once, quickly, then again more slowly, and the uncertainty he had felt watching Celine on the platform sharpened into something with edges. The militia that defended Ashcroft, the note said, was not a militia. It fought in formations that did not match any documented Lycan military doctrine. It conducted 3 separate coordinated night strikes against the advancing army while simultaneously running a supply interdiction operation that left Tashin's forces without clean water for 9 days in contested territory. It operated in near total silence. No signals, no calls, no drum communication. As though every fighter in it could read the intentions of every other fighter without speaking. The garrison soldiers who survived Silvermarsh, the note said, refused to discuss what they had fought. Not out of reticence, out of something that read more like the specific kind of silence that comes after a person has seen something they cannot explain and have decided the safest response is to forget it completely. The Shadow Fang, Raiden said. It was not a question. Dosan nodded once. The Shadow Fang Legion was history, or so the history claimed. A legendary Lycan military force assembled 3 decades ago, trained in doctrine so advanced that most current tactical academies still studied its campaign records as theoretical models. It had operated during the civil conflicts of the previous generation with a lethality that was so consistent, so methodical, and so completely untrackable that even the kingdoms it had fought on behalf of had never fully understood what they were employing. Then the civil armistice of 31 years ago had dissolved the major conflict alliances, and the Shadow Fang had simply stopped being reported. No dissolution, no documented disbandment, no final campaign. It had withdrawn from the historical record the way a tide withdraws from a shore, completely and without announcement. Generals on 3 continents had spent decades arguing about whether it still existed. They had never found proof either way. She's their commander, Raiden said. My source believed so. Before she disappeared, she sent one additional message. Dawson was quiet for a moment. She said that the mute woman the garrison captured after Silvermarsh was not captured. She said the woman walked into custody deliberately, that she had been in a position to extract herself for 3 days before she allowed the arrest. Raiden stopped walking. A cart rolled past on the cobblestones. A child yelled something at a dog from a window above the street. The ordinary machinery of a city that had no idea what was moving through it. She's already inside, he said. She's been inside for 11 months, Dawson said, processing through the capture system, moving through the servant auctions. She has been waiting. Waiting for what? I don't know. My source died before she could find out. Dawson's voice did not change when he said this. He had been in this business long enough that the deaths of sources registered as facts rather than losses, or he had learned to process them that way, which was possibly a distinction without a difference at this point. What I know is that she is currently the most unknown variable in the capital's security situation. I know that having her outside the palace is a worse risk than having her inside it, and I know that you just paid 100 gold to put her in the one building she may have spent the better part of a year trying to get into. Raiden looked back toward the square, though they were too far now for him to see anything. Then I need to know what she's doing in my house, he said. Yes, Dawson said. You do. The servants' wing of Blackthorn Palace occupied the northeastern quarter of the lower structure, a long series of connected rooms with low ceilings and narrow windows that let in gray light for about 4 hours each day before the shadow of the North Tower swallowed them. The beds were functional. The bedding was clean, if not warm. The walls were bare stone, which sweated moisture in the cold months and radiated heat in the summer months, and the overall effect was of a space designed by someone who had thought about the minimum requirements of human shelter and stopped thinking there. Celine was shown to a room on the third passage by a senior housekeeper named Marta, a wide-shouldered woman in her 50s with an efficient manner and the faintly wary expression of someone who had been doing her job long enough to know that new arrivals were usually more trouble than the intake assessment suggested. "You'll work mornings in the upper gallery," Marta told her, speaking in the slightly elevated volume people unconsciously adopted when addressing someone they knew couldn't respond. "Cleaning, maintenance, whatever the chamberlains direct. Afternoons you'll be assigned to wherever there's need. You're not to enter the king's private wing, the strategy rooms in the East Tower, or the treasury passages. You understand?" Celine looked at her and nodded once. Marta studied her for a moment with the practiced eye of a woman who had processed dozens of acquisitions from the auction blocks and knew well enough that what the intake report said about a person and what was actually true about a person were often two separate documents. "You've done palace service before," Marta said. It was not quite a question. Celine held her gaze and gave nothing. "Fine," Marta said. "Keep to yourself, do your work, and there won't be trouble. There's water for washing in the basin. Supper is at the 6th bell." She turned to leave, then stopped. "The other women will have questions about where you came from. You don't have to answer. Most of them have sense enough not to push." A brief pause, weighted with something Marta did not quite say. "The ones who don't have sense, come find me." She left. Celine sat on the edge of the narrow bed for exactly 90 seconds. Then she stood, went to the window, and studied the angle of the light, the shape of the courtyard below, the placement of the two guards she could see at the corner of the south wall. She noted the patrol pattern, every 11 minutes approximately, though the variation suggested the guards were not working from a fixed schedule, but from habit, which meant the interval could drift. She noted the height of the surrounding wall and the placement of the iron torch brackets, which would create predictable light and shadow patterns after dark. She noted the distance from the window to the outer walkway and the material of the wall beneath the sill. Then she turned away from the window and began memorizing the room. There was a difference between looking at a space and knowing it. Celine had learned that difference at 14 years old in the first winter she spent commanding soldiers who were twice her age, in a valley she had never visited before, preparing a defense against a force that outnumbered them 3-1. Looking at terrain told you what it was. Knowing terrain told you what it could become. She ran her fingers along the interior wall, feeling for variation in the stone that might indicate a structural gap, a concealed passage, a weakness. She pressed her palm against the wooden door and felt for the sound transmission quality of it. How much of a conversation held in the passage outside would filter through. She found the loose stone near the floor on the east wall and noted its position. She counted paces from door to window, door to bed, bed to wall. 11 minutes later, she heard the guard's footsteps below, and the interval matched what she had estimated, and she filed this information alongside everything else. She did not think about the auction block. She did not think about the month she had spent in a holding facility outside Thalvain, with her wrists bound and her voice locked away behind a discipline she had built over years and maintained over the past 11 months, with the same relentless consistency with which she maintained everything else. She did not think about the smell of that place, or the sound of it, or the specific quality of cold that comes from stone floors in autumn. She thought about what she was here to find. The upper gallery ran the entire length of the palace's ceremonial wing, a space of high ceilings and stone columns and tall windows that looked out over the inner courtyard on one side and the Black Mountains to the north on the other. In the mornings, before the court filled, it held only the gray quiet of a place built for spectacle that existed, in its off hours, as pure architecture. Celine worked it for the first 3 days without attracting attention, which was the intended outcome. She learned the rhythm of the palace the way she learned all terrain, by moving through it consistently until its patterns became automatic, until she could navigate its schedules and social geography without needing to think about them. The chamberlains gave direction without looking at her. The nobles who moved through the gallery in the mornings looked past her with the habitual ease of people who had spent their entire lives not seeing servants. The guards at the major junctions noted her presence and stopped noting it by the second day, which was precisely the point. On the fourth day, she was assigned to the East Corridor. The East Corridor was outside the restricted zones, technically. It ran parallel to the strategy rooms in the East Tower, separated by a wall of standard construction, approximately 18 inches of dressed stone. 18 inches of stone attenuated sound by roughly 40% under normal acoustic conditions, which meant that a conversation conducted at normal speaking volume in the strategy rooms would be reduced to a murmur in the corridor, and a raised voice would be reduced to intelligible fragments. Celine worked the East Corridor slowly and thoroughly on her fourth day. She caught fragments of 3 separate conversations. The first was logistical, a discussion between what sounded like 2 junior officers about supply manifest discrepancies. She filed it without weight. The second was more interesting. A voice she did not yet recognize telling a second voice that the Northern Dispatch needed to be delayed. Not for the stated reason, but for a different one that the wall ate before she could catch it. She marked the voice in her memory and moved on. The third conversation stopped her, not visibly. Nothing about her movement changed, nothing about the angle of her body or the motion of her hands against the stone she was maintaining. But her attention locked with an absolute completeness that took over everything else. The voice was low and controlled, the particular control of a man who chose every word and knew that being overheard was always a possibility. She caught only pieces. Enough pieces. The word Velarin. The phrase within the fortnight, a number that sounded like a count of something. 3,000, possibly, or 30,000. The wall was imprecise on scale. And then, clearly, in a momentary acoustic alignment that the wall could not prevent. The king will not leave that room alive. Then nothing. Footsteps moving away. Celine set down the cleaning cloth and looked at the wall for one moment. She had been in this palace for 4 days. She had come here for her own reasons, built over months of planning and intelligence and the particular cold patience that was possibly the most important skill she had ever developed. She had not come here to save a king. She had not come here out of any loyalty to Nocturne authority or any interest in the continuation of Raiden Drakar's particular reign. She had come here because whoever was moving inside this palace was the same network that had burned Ashcroft, and she had unfinished business with that network. But there was a man on the other side of that wall who apparently had less than a fortnight to live, and that timeline intersected with her own timeline in a way that could not be ignored without collapsing everything she had built. She picked up the cloth. She went back to work. She began to think about the problem with the careful, unhurried precision that had saved her life more times than she could count. The precision of someone who understood that panic was simply a way of adding additional problems to the existing ones, and that existing problems were already sufficient. It was on the 6th day that he noticed her. Not the way the chamberlains noticed her, which was as a function in the maintenance of the palace. Not the way the nobles noticed her, which was not at all. The way Raiden noticed her was specific to him. The noticing of a man who had survived long enough to develop a category in his thinking for things that were incongruent with their context. He was crossing the upper gallery on his way from the morning war council to the anteroom where 3 provincial governors were waiting to discuss border tax disputes. And he was doing this without particular attention to the gallery itself because he had walked it approximately 4,000 times, and his mind was occupied with the information from the council, and specifically with the fact that General Torvek's border assessment had been filtered before it reached the council table. He knew it had been filtered because he had a copy of Torvek's original transmission, which Dawson had obtained through channels that did not officially exist, and the original said several things that the council version did not say, and the gap between those 2 documents was the kind of gap that got kingdoms killed. He was thinking about that gap when he saw her. She was working the far end of the gallery, maintaining the stone around one of the north windows, and there was nothing in what she was doing that was wrong. The motion was correct. The tools were correct. She was placed exactly where a servant assigned to the gallery's morning maintenance would be placed. but she had angled her position so that the window she was working reflected the council room doorway. It was a very small reflection. An observer without specific reason to look for it would not have noticed it. The angle was not aggressive. It was barely sufficient, in fact, using the slight curvature in the old window glass to bend the reflected image in a way that required specific knowledge of the window's optical properties. Knowledge that would require prior observation of the window across multiple light conditions to develop. She had been here 6 days. Raiden did not slow his pace. He did not look at her directly. He walked the gallery at exactly the speed he had been walking it and exited through the West Passage and went to meet the governors. And the governors spent an unproductive hour explaining why the border tax revenue was lower than the assessment, and he spent that hour listening with the surface of his attention while the rest of it worked through what he had just seen. She had studied that window. She had identified its optical properties. She had positioned herself to use a tool, a reflective surface in a window, that she would have had to find and assess and catalog in 6 days of work. And she had done it without triggering any of the palace's observation systems, which were extensive and which Raiden had personally reviewed the week before her arrival. He sent for Dawson before the governors left the anteroom. "She's moved through 4 different sections in 6 days, Dawson said. He had a small journal in his hand, which contained no names, but which Raiden could read as fluently as plain text at this point. Upper gallery, east corridor, south receiving hall, and the passage outside the records office. What's in the records office? Tax documents, trade manifests, historical correspondence going back to the previous reign. And beside it, Dawson paused. The staff archive, service records for every person employed in the palace for the past 60 years. She's building a map, Raiden said, of the palace and everyone in it. What they have access to, how long they've been here, what changed in their service record around specific dates. He stood at the window of his private study, looking out at the courtyard. Somewhere below, probably, she was working, probably watching something. Dawson, the voice we flagged in the Valoran correspondence, the one without a confirmed identity. Yes. How long has that voice been in the palace? Dawson was quiet for a moment with a quality that meant he was putting something together that he should have put together earlier and was deciding how to present that. The phonetic analysis puts the speaker's formative speech patterns in the northern province, upper-class household, educated. How long? If the accent is natural rather than performed, at least 20 years in the court environment, possibly more. Raiden turned from the window. She already knows who it is. You think she identified them before we did? I think she's been doing this longer than we have, and she came in here knowing what she was looking for. He moved to his desk, not sitting, standing behind it with his hands on its surface. She has the information. She may have had it before she walked through the gate. What she doesn't have is confirmation that you're aware of the threat, Dawson said. The silence between them had the specific texture of a conversation that had just arrived at a decision point. Put Rain on her, Raiden said. Rain was his best surveillance operative, a woman with the gift of absolute ordinariness, the kind of face that people forgot 30 seconds after they saw it. Not to interfere, to watch. I want to know what she knows when she knows it. And if she moves on the target before we do? Raiden picked up the border dispatch from his desk, Torvek's real one, not the filtered version, and looked at the numbers on it. Then she moves first, he said, and we learn why. On the 9th day, Celine found the name. It was in the staff archive, which she accessed during the 40-minute window when the records keeper took his midday meal and the junior archive assistant went to assist with a supply delivery in the South Yard. A delivery that had been arranged at some remove and through intermediaries who did not know they were intermediaries by Celine herself 11 days before she arrived at the palace. Planning was everything. Planning was the difference between a force that survived and a force that got spent. The armies Celine had commanded had sometimes fought, outnumbered 4 and 5 to 1, and had emerged intact not because they were stronger than the opposing force, but because the opposing force had been encountering the outcomes of plans that were made weeks and months before the battle began. Her soldiers understood this. They had been trained to understand it. The greatest victories were the ones where the fight itself was almost a formality. The real work was done in the silences before anyone drew a blade. She worked through the archive with controlled efficiency. She was not searching randomly. She had a specific string of information, phonetic data, access patterns, the dates of several suspicious administrative decisions she had cross-referenced against the East Corridor fragments. And she was triangulating. The name she arrived at, after 17 minutes, was not one she recognized. But the service record that went with it was precise and damning and explained several things she had not previously been able to account for. Lord Advisor Castor Vane, 23 years in palace service, elevated to Senior Advisory Council in the current reign. Unremarkable record on the surface, the record of a competent bureaucrat who had advanced through proximity to power and administrative reliability. But the record had a seam in it, a period of approximately 18 months, 11 years ago, that was documented with a specificity that paradoxically made it suspicious. Too much documentation for a period that was supposed to be a routine assignment to the Eastern Territories. The kind of over-documentation that appears when someone has spent considerable effort constructing a past they want to be unquestionable. And nested in the personnel cross-references, a family connection to a minor house that had been absorbed into the Mirath Alliance territory 2 decades ago. Celine replaced every document exactly as she had found it. She left the archive. She walked back to the upper gallery and resumed her morning work. And her face showed nothing, and her hands were steady against the stone. She had her confirmation. She had her target identified. Now she needed to assess the timeline. The phrase "within the fortnight," overheard through 18 inches of stone, had been spoken 9 days ago, which meant she had approximately 5 days. She stood at the north window, not the reflective one, a different window, one that looked directly out at the courtyard, and looked at the black mountains rising beyond the palace wall, and for a brief moment, just one, she permitted herself to think about what came after this. After Vane, after the network that had used him, after the reason she had come here, which was older and colder and more personal than any of it, and which she had maintained at a careful distance from her operational thinking for 11 months, because the personal reasons were the ones that got you killed when you let them close. Her soldiers were out there, 1,200 of them, dispersed through the city and the surrounding territory in configurations she had designed over the past year, embedded in the population with the patience and discipline that was the Shadowfang's oldest and most essential tradition. They did not move without her signal. They did not act without her direction. They had waited 11 months already. They would wait 5 more days. She put her hand flat against the cold glass of the window. She was still standing there, perfectly motionless, when she heard the footsteps behind her. Not a servant's footsteps, not the measured, route-based pace of the guards. Something else. Something that moved with the particular controlled weight of a person who was accustomed to moving in ways that other people couldn't predict. She did not turn. "You've been in my East Corridor twice this week," said Raiden Draker. His voice at close range was different from what she'd heard across the auction square. Lower, with a friction in it, the voice of a man who had given commands until commands became the natural register of his speech. "And you've been in the records office and the staff archive, and you've been using that window." A brief pause, a gesture she felt rather than saw, directed at the reflective window 30 feet down the gallery, "to watch who comes in and out of my council room." He stopped a few feet behind her. She could feel the precision of that distance, close enough to demonstrate that he wasn't afraid of her, far enough to give himself reaction time if she moved. He had assessed her as a threat and chosen a distance that accounted for that assessment without advertising it. She noted this. "I also know," he said, "that you are not what your intake documents say you are." Celine turned. She met his eyes with the same quality she had brought to the auction platform, the same complete absence of performance. No fear, no submission, no aggression, just assessment, returned at equal measure to the assessment he was giving her. He was studying her face the way she studied terrain. "The women in the servants' wing," he said, "say you don't sleep, that you're awake before the morning watch every day." He paused. "The guard on the south gate says your head moves differently from other servants when you pass, like you're counting footfalls." She did count footfalls. She had been counting since she was 14 years old, and she no longer had to think about it, which apparently, in certain light, was visible. "I'm going to ask you one question," Raiden said. His voice did not change. It was the voice of a man who had decided something before entering this room and was simply completing the decision's last step. "And you can't answer it with words, so you'll answer it the only way available to you. Honestly or dishonestly, and I'll know the difference. He held her gaze. Castor Vane, he said. The name fell into the gallery the way a stone falls into still water, and Celine watched his eyes while he watched hers, and in the silence that followed, she made a decision that she had not expected to make in this room on this morning, a decision that ran counter to 11 months of discipline and operational protocol, and the fundamental principles of concealment that had kept her alive. She gave him one single, precise, unambiguous nod. His jaw tightened. Something moved behind his eyes, not surprise exactly. The look of a man confirming what he already suspected and finding the confirmation worse than the suspicion. How long? He said quietly. She held up her hand, spread her fingers. 9. 9 days. He understood. She could see him understanding, the calculation happening in real time on his face. She had known for 9 days. She had known 3 days before he had. The fortnight, he said. She nodded. The gallery was very quiet. Somewhere below, the morning watch was changing, and she could hear the distant rhythm of boots on stone, and the light through the north windows had gone gray with incoming cloud, and Raiden Drakkar stood 3 feet away from her with the particular stillness of a man who has just understood the full shape of a situation he has been seeing only the edges of. You're not here because I bought you, he said. It was not a question. Celine held his gaze. And then she did something she had not done in 11 months. She reached into the loose hem of her work tunic, the hem that Marta and the Chamberlains had assessed and found unremarkable because it was unremarkable to the eye, and she withdrew a small, tightly folded piece of paper and held it out. Raiden took it. He unfolded it. He read it. She watched the color leave his face. This is... He stopped. He read it again. His hand, holding the paper, was very still. This is Vane's handwriting. She had obtained it from the archive cross-references, from a requisition order signed 14 years ago, before Vane had presumably understood the value of obscuring his hand. She had matched it to the partial document her network had recovered from the Velaran courier, the one Dawson had referenced but had apparently not yet fully decoded. The paper in Raiden's hand contained the complete decoded correspondence, including the portion that named the specific method, the specific location, and the specific individual, a senior guard, recently rotated onto the king's personal security rotation, who was going to carry out the execution, including the date, 3 days from now. Raiden looked up from the paper. He looked at her. The full weight of what she had just put in his hands was visible on his face, and she could see him working through the implications, all of them, including the ones that circled back to her and to why she had this information, and what it meant that she had handed it to him instead of using it for her own purposes. Who are you? He said. His voice had changed, not softer, harder, in a different way. The hardness of a question that had just become the most important question in the room. Before she could answer, before she could move, before the moment resolved into any of the trajectories that were available to it, the gallery doors at the far end opened, and Lord Castor Vane walked in. He was crossing toward the East Passage, unhurried, with a leather document case under his arm and the confident stride of a man who moved through power because power had always moved around him. He had not yet seen them. He would, in approximately 7 seconds. Celine's right hand was already moving when Vane looked up, not toward a weapon. She had no weapon, not visibly, not in any configuration that a palace search would have found. What her hand moved toward was the wall beside her, a specific stone, third from the window frame, slightly recessed from the surrounding surface, and her fingers found it the way fingers find a thing they have touched 100 times in rehearsal, without looking, without hesitation. She pressed once, short, then twice, long. To anyone watching, it would have appeared to be the reflexive, steadying motion of a servant who had startled at a noise. It was not. It was a signal, transmitted through the vibration of the palace's old stone infrastructure in a frequency pattern that the Shadow Fang had been using for 30 years, carried by the building itself to receivers positioned throughout the lower structure. The signal said, "Hold, do not move, do not act, wait." Vane's eyes found them across the gallery. He stopped walking. The calculation that moved across his face was fast and professional. The calculation of a man who had spent decades operating inside power structures and had developed the particular instinct of someone for whom every unexpected encounter required immediate threat assessment. He saw the king. He saw the servant. He saw the distance between them and the quality of that distance, which was not the distance of a king addressing a servant. He recovered in under 2 seconds. "Your Majesty," Vane said. His voice was smooth, the practiced smoothness of a court voice that had been deployed in difficult rooms for 2 decades. He continued walking toward them, unhurried, the document case still under his arm. "I didn't expect you in the gallery this morning. The council indicated you were in meetings until midday." "Plans change," Raiden said. The paper was gone. Celine had registered the moment he folded it back, had registered the motion of his hand moving it inside his coat without looking at her, without breaking eye contact with Vane. He was good. She filed this. Vane reached them and stopped at a comfortable distance. Not so close as to seem aggressive, not so far as to suggest avoidance. The document case was leather-bound, well-maintained, the kind of object that advertised its owner's administrative legitimacy. He glanced at Celine with the brief, dismissive thoroughness of a man cataloging something that does not require further attention. "New acquisition?" he said. "She works the gallery," Raiden said. "Yes." Vane looked away from her. "I wanted to discuss the Northern Province revenue figures with you, when you have a moment. The current projection has some complications that I think warrant direct review before they reach the full council." Raiden looked at him. There was a quality to this look that Celine had not yet had cause to observe directly, having spent her first 9 days in the palace, maintaining careful distance from the king's immediate vicinity. She observed it now. It was not hostile, and it was not warm, and it was not the blank authority face that rulers deployed in public settings. It was the look of a man who was looking at another person and simultaneously looking through them at everything he now knew was behind them. It was, she thought, possibly the most dangerous look she had ever seen on a face that was not doing anything visible at all. "Tomorrow morning," Raiden said, after the Eastern briefing. "Of course." Vane inclined his head slightly. The court nod, deferential in form, routine in the texture. He moved past them toward the East Passage, footsteps even, pace unchanged. He did not look back. The gallery doors closed behind him. Raiden did not move for 3 seconds. "He knows I know," he said. Celine shook her head. He looked at her. "No?" She shook her head again, then she held up 2 fingers, touched them to her eye, and gestured toward where Vane had gone. "He suspects you know something. He doesn't know what." Raiden was quiet for a moment, reading this. "If he suspected confirmation," he said, "he would have moved the timeline forward." She nodded. "So we have 3 days." He said it the way people said things that were technically true but practically insufficient. "And I have a traitor in my advisory council, a compromised guard on my personal security rotation, and an army somewhere that apparently answers to a mute servant I purchased at a public auction 6 days ago." He paused. "I'm going to need you to tell me what you're actually doing in my palace." Celine looked at him. Then she did something that was going to cost her a great deal of operational security, and which she had already decided, in the 14 seconds since she handed him the paper, was the necessary move. She had built enough walls in her life to know when maintaining one was costing more than it protected. She put out her hand. He looked at it. "You want something to write on?" She waited. He produced a small bound dispatch book from his interior coat pocket, the kind of pocket that also contained, she noted from the brief motion, at minimum 1 additional document and the handle of a blade that was not visible under his coat, but was carried in a way that indicated habitual, not ceremonial use. He handed the book and the accompanying pencil to her. She wrote for approximately 45 seconds. She handed it back. He read. What he read was not the full truth. It was the portion of the truth that the situation required, which was a calibration she had made deliberately and would maintain. The full truth was hers. It had been hers for a long time, and she had not survived this long by distributing it without measurement. What she wrote was this: I came for the network that destroyed my territory, not your throne. They used your palace as a base of operation. Vane is a middle link. The architect is someone above him. I have been mapping the chain for 9 months across 3 holding facilities and 2 auctions. I am close. If you move on Vane now, the chain collapses before we reach the top. If you wait and I finish what I came to do, you get the whole network. Your choice. Raiden read it twice. He did not look up immediately when he finished. He looked at the words on the page, and Celine watched his face while he processed what was written on it, which was a thing she did with every significant person she had encountered in 48 combined months of operational work across 4 territories. The face did not lie in the way speech lied. The body did not compose its responses with the same facility. A man who trained himself to control his voice and his expression and his physical bearing, a man like this one, who had clearly been doing exactly that for a long time, still moved his weight in certain moments, still tightened certain muscles, still let the truth surface in the interval before the composure reclosed over it. What she read on Raiden's face in that interval was not what she expected. She expected calculation. She got that. She expected the specific set of the jaw that meant he was deciding how much of the power in this exchange he was going to tolerate surrendering. She got that too. What she had not expected was the thing underneath both of those. A look she did not have an immediate category for, which was unusual enough that she marked it and held it in a different part of her thinking, separate from the operational assessment, for examination later. It was something close to relief, not the relief of a problem solved, the relief of a man who has been holding a weight alone for a very long time and has just discovered that the weight is, possibly, shareable. She had not expected that from him. She filed it without weight. "Above Vane," he said finally. His voice was quiet. Not the quiet of controlled volume, but the quiet of a man who was choosing words that he was not yet ready to say at full register. "You have a candidate." She shook her head once. "Not yet. But you will." She met his eyes. Yes. He stood with the dispatch book in his hand, and she could see him working through the implications of the deal she had just laid out, which was not a comfortable set of implications to work through. She was asking him to allow a threat to his life to remain operational for 3 more days on the basis that she would deliver him something larger at the end of it. She was asking him to trust a woman he had owned for 6 days, who had entered his palace under a manufactured identity, who commanded a military force he could not verify and could not control, who had just demonstrated that she had been moving inside his security infrastructure with complete freedom and complete invisibility for the better part of his reign. She was asking him, in other words, to do the thing that was hardest for a man like this, not act. This was the thing about men who had built themselves into instruments of dominance, and Raiden Drakkar had done this. She could read the whole of it in the way he stood and moved and spoke, the systematic replacement of vulnerability with capability that had been happening in his body and his mind since probably before he was 20 years old. The thing that survival taught certain men at certain costs was that waiting was weakness, that the correct response to a threat was to close on it immediately, with maximum force, and resolve it before it resolved you. That hesitation was the room in which you got killed. It was a lesson that was correct often enough to become instinct. An instinct, when it calcified into reflex, was the thing that got you killed in situations that required the opposite. She watched him understand this. She watched him understand that she was asking him to override 30 years of survival instinct, and that the logic of overriding it was sound, and that sound logic and instinct lived in entirely different parts of a person and were not automatically on speaking terms. 3 days, he said. She nodded. You don't move on anything without telling me first. She considered this. Then she held up one hand, flat, palm out, the gesture for a conditional yes rather than an unconditional one. He read it correctly. Or I don't get the intelligence in time for it to matter. She nodded. He looked at her for a long moment. Dawson was right, he said. It did not seem to be directed at her specifically. He handed back the dispatch book. He told me this morning that the most dangerous game I could play was the one where I already knew the board and moved anyway like I didn't. He put the pencil in his coat pocket. I've been playing it for 11 years. He turned toward the West Passage. Vane meets with his contact every 3rd day, he said, without looking back at her. If you don't already know that, your map has a gap. She already knew it, but the fact that he knew it told her something about what Dawson had already assembled, and that was worth the information exchange. Cray Dawson met with Raiden in the small study off the war room at midday, and the meeting had the quality of 2 people who had already been having a conversation that had now arrived at a new chapter. She gave you the Vane decode, Dawson said. It was not a question. She had it 3 days before we did. Dawson received this with the expression of a man adding an uncomfortable data point to a model he had already found uncomfortable. What does she want? She wants the architect. Same as us, different reason. Her reason being, the network burned her territory. Raiden sat behind his desk and looked at the border dispatch, while Torvek's real one, still lying where he had left it. The Legion didn't go dark because of the Civil War ceasefire. It went dark because someone forced it dark. Burned the Ashcroft holding, killed her people, drove the survivors underground. She's been reconstructing the chain ever since. Dawson was quiet for a moment. How many soldiers? She didn't say. Best estimate. Raiden picked up the dispatch. 1,200, maybe more, dispersed through the city infrastructure and the outer territories. He set it down. We have no idea where they are. We have no idea if they're real, Dawson said carefully. If they weren't real, Tashin's full garrison wouldn't have spent 3 weeks trying to take Silvermarsh and ended up needing reinforcement. If they weren't real, the victory report wouldn't have a 10-day gap in it that nobody in the filing office has been able to explain. He looked at Dawson. They're real. The question is whether they're currently a resource or a risk. And that depends on whether she's telling you the truth. It depends on whether her goals and ours are aligned enough that the distinction between truth and tactical cooperation doesn't matter for the next 3 days. Raiden leaned back. She wants the architect. We want the architect. She has information we don't have yet. We have the operational position she needs. You're proposing a working relationship with a woman who could take this palace if she decided to. I'm proposing a working relationship with a woman who has had 11 months to take this palace and instead spent those months building a case. He met Dawson's eyes. She doesn't want the throne, Dawson. She wants the person who took everything from her. That's a different animal entirely, and you know it. Dawson turned to look at the window. Outside, the inner courtyard was moving with the ordinary traffic of the afternoon shift change. Guards cycling through their rotations, servants crossing with trays and packages, and the tools of the palace's constant maintenance. Somewhere in that ordinary motion, Dawson knew, there were eyes that belonged to neither the palace nor his own network. There's something else, he said. The Mirath Alliance has been quiet for 3 weeks. No courier intercepts, no signal traffic, nothing from our border assets. Quiet like preparing or quiet like regrouping? Quiet like someone told them to stop communicating on channels we could monitor. Dawson turned back. The network has reached beyond Noctara. Whatever the architect is building, it isn't limited to this palace. Raiden was still for a moment. Outside there was a sound, a single bird, a winter crow, landing on the sill with a brief rattle of claws against stone and then gone. The fortnight, he said. Vane's timeline. What if it isn't an assassination? Dawson looked at him. What if it's a signal, Raiden said. The death is a trigger, something coordinated to happen at the same moment, inside and outside the border, that requires a confirmed event here first. The silence between them had the weight of a thing that had just become significantly larger. I need to know what she knows about the external network, Dawson said. I know. She may not tell us. She'll tell us what she decides we need. Raiden stood. Work with that. She was in the south receiving hall in the early afternoon when the junior chamberlain named Pell found her. Pell was 20 years old and the second son of a minor house that had lost its landholdings in a border dispute 7 years ago and had not recovered. He had the anxious competence of someone who worked twice as hard as everyone around him because he understood that he had no margin, and he moved through the palace with a careful, forward-leaning quality like a man perpetually braced for the floor to drop. Celine had assessed him on her second day and concluded he was honest and frightened and neither useful nor dangerous, which was the profile of most of the palace's service staff. Today he was neither anxious nor careful. He was frightened in a different way. The king wants you in the east anteroom, he said, keeping his voice low and his eyes off her face in the way people kept their eyes off things that made them uncertain. Now. She set down the cloth she was holding and followed him. The east anteroom was the waiting room outside one of the minor council chambers, a space furnished with benches and a cold fireplace, and the particular bare practicality of a room that existed to hold people before they were taken somewhere else. When Celine arrived, it was empty except for Raiden, who was standing, and a man she had not yet encountered directly but had identified from a distance on day 4. Cray Dawson looked at her the way she imagined he looked at most things, with the flat, cataloging attention of someone who was compiling a file in real time. "Sit down," Raiden said, and there was something in his voice that hadn't been in the gallery. An edge, not aggressive. The edge of a man who had received new information since their last conversation, and the information had changed the geometry of the situation. She sat. Dawson stayed standing near the window. He had a small journal in his hand. "The guard on the king's rotation," he said. "His name is Ren Hassel, age 31, in his current post for 40 days. Before that, the Southern Gate for 7 years." He paused. "His sister lives in the Mirath borderlands." Celine looked at him. "We became aware of him through the Velarin correspondence," Dosan continued. "We had planned to move him off the rotation quietly, reassign him, contain the threat. Standard protocol." Another pause. "This morning he requested emergency leave, family illness." She understood immediately. She held up her hand and touched her fingers together, the gesture she used when she needed to write. Dawson produced a small notebook from his pocket and held it out. She wrote quickly and handed it back. He read it. His expression did not change, but something shifted behind his eyes. He handed it to Raiden. The note said, "He has been activated. The timeline has moved. Not 3 days. Tonight." Raiden read it and looked up at her. "How certain?" She held up all 10 fingers, completely. "Basis," Dawson said. She took the notebook back. Wrote, "Emergency leave requested same day as my signal in the gallery. Vane was in the gallery. He saw me with the king at close distance. He doesn't know what passed between us, but the proximity was non-standard. He is not a man who leaves non-standard variables unaddressed." Dawson read it. "She's right," he said to Raiden. His voice had the tone of a man who found being right about an unpleasant thing unrewarding. Vane is risk-averse in the tactical sense. He would accelerate rather than wait with an unknown in play. "Which means tonight," Raiden said. "Which means tonight." The room was quiet for a moment. Raiden looked at Celine with the focused attention that she was beginning to recognize as his particular mode of assessment. Not the broad scan attention of someone taking in a situation, but the narrow, deep attention of a man drilling into a specific point. "You knew this was a possible outcome when you signaled in the gallery," he said. "You knew that Vane seeing us together could accelerate the timeline." She met his eyes. "You chose to show your hand anyway," he said. "Why?" She considered how to answer this, or whether to answer it, and then she took the notebook and wrote 2 words and handed it back. He read it. The 2 words were, "Because you." He read them again, and the room was very quiet. "Because I would have moved on Vane on my own timeline," he said. Not a question. She nodded. "And if I moved on him before you reached the architect, the chain collapses." She nodded again. He looked at the 2 words for another moment, then handed the notebook back to Dawson, who filed the interaction with the professional neutrality of a man who had long ago stopped being surprised by the things that happened in rooms he occupied. "Hassel will come for me in my private quarters," Raiden said. "It's the only time in my schedule that doesn't have a 3-person security presence." "He has access to the private wing passage," Dawson said. "As of 40 days ago, yes. So we know the where." Raiden looked at Celine. "The question is whether we let it happen and use it, or stop it and lose the trigger event." Celine took the notebook, wrote, "Let it happen," with modification. Modification meaning, she wrote, "You're not in the room." The silence that followed had a specific texture to it. The texture of a man being asked to allow an attempt on his life to proceed against a target that was not himself, which raised specific questions about what the target was. "The modifications to the private quarters," Raiden said slowly. He was looking at her with the full weight of his attention. The stone resonance, the signal architecture in the walls. She wrote, "My soldiers have been in the private wing for 11 months. The decoy needs to be convincing for approximately 4 minutes. Dosan set down his journal very carefully. 4 minutes for what? Raiden said. She wrote, "For Hassel to complete the attempt and transmit confirmation to Vane, and for Vane to transmit to the architect, and for my people to have that transmission before he knows the attempt failed." The 3 of them sat with this. It was, Raiden thought, one of the most audacious pieces of operational planning he had encountered in 30 years of warfare and court politics. It used a living king as bait in an assassination he was not present for, relied on a military force he could not see or verify, and required a 4-minute window of perfect coordination between people who had never worked together under conditions that would be entirely improvised on the night. He thought about what it meant that she had designed this plan 11 months ago, that she had entered those first holding facilities and the auction circuits and this palace, knowing that this was where it ended. Not with a confrontation she initiated, but with an event she let happen and used. That the entire 11 months of silence and patience and meticulous mapping had been in service of this specific 4-minute window. He thought about what it cost a person to hold that kind of patience. He had been the most feared man in Noctara for 15 years, and he was not certain he could have done it. "Your people in the private wing," he said. "How long have they been positioned there?" She wrote, "Since the day I arrived." 6 days. She shook her head. She pointed to the first word she had written, "since," and then held up all 10 fingers and then one more. 11. 11 months. Before she arrived. They had been in position before she arrived. Raiden looked at Dawson. Dawson looked back with the expression of a man who was having a thorough reassessment of his understanding of the palace's security situation. "We've had agents in that wing for 11 months, Dawson said, "and we didn't know." She took the notebook, wrote 3 words, and handed it back. "You still don't." The night came in fast and cold, the way winter nights came in the mountain territories, not gradually, but with the sudden categorical quality of a dropped curtain. 1 hour there was gray light, and then there was not. Raiden moved through his evening routine with absolute normalcy, which required a specific kind of controlled performance that he had not practiced before, and found, unexpectedly, more difficult than he anticipated. Not because the performance itself was hard. He had been performing various versions of composure in dangerous rooms for most of his adult life, but because the thing he was performing normalcy inside of was the knowledge that tonight his private quarters would contain an assassin, and he would not be in them, and the outcome depended on a plan built by a woman he had known for 6 days. He sat through a supper with 3 council members and ate, and spoke, and moved his wine glass at intervals, and the council members discussed the northern trade disruptions, and he contributed the correct amount to the conversation, and nothing in his face or body showed the particular cold clarity of a man who is existing in 2 times simultaneously, the present moment and the moment 4 hours from now, which had already been decided but had not yet arrived. He thought about the 2 words she had written, "because you." He had been asking an operational question. Why had she shown her hand in the gallery, knowing the risk it created? The answer was operational. She had calculated that he would move on Vane independently and collapse the chain she had spent 11 months building. That was the surface answer, and it was true. But he had read the 2 words several times, and he was fairly certain they contained more than the operational layer, and he was not sure what to do with that certainty, and so he set it in the same place. He set most things he could not currently use, and continued eating supper and listening to the northern trade situation. Power, he had learned early, and at considerable cost, was not what most people believed it to be. Most people believed power was the capacity to make others do what you wanted. It was a definition that was accurate at the crude level. Yes, the king could compel, could command, could execute. But the definition missed the most important thing about power, which was that it was always relational. You were powerful in relation to something, and what you were powerful in relation to changed the nature of the power entirely. He had been powerful in relation to armies, in relation to courts, in relation to enemies who came at him with steel and strategies he could read and counter. The kind of power he understood was kinetic. It moved, it struck, it held territory. The kind of power she carried was a different animal. It was the power of perfect invisibility, of absolute patience, of knowing a room so completely that you could predict what would happen in it before the people inside it made their decisions. It was the power of being fundamentally underestimated, and she had built it deliberately, had chosen the appearance of powerlessness the way a blade chooses a sheath, not as concealment, but as part of the weapon's design. He had spent 30 years making himself impossible to ignore. She had spent a comparable time making herself impossible to see. He did not know which of those was harder. The private wing was quiet at the 10th bell. The guard rotation had been adjusted, quietly, through Dawson's channels, with cover reasons plausible enough not to flag, so that the passage outside the king's chamber would have a gap of 6 minutes in its coverage at the 11th bell. 6 minutes was more than sufficient for a trained operative to reach the private chamber door, pass through it, and complete a targeted action inside. Hassel had been given a key through whatever channel Vane used for such transfers. The key was real. What was in the chamber was not. Celine stood in the service passage, 3 corridors west of the private wing, and pressed her palm flat against the stone wall and waited. She had not used the moonbound signal architecture in 11 months. She had maintained it the way you maintained a weapon you weren't currently carrying. Through discipline, through the small daily practices that kept the capability alive, even when the capability was not being deployed. Now she used it the way she used everything she had built, precisely and without waste. The signal moved through the stone. It said, "Now, positions. Hold the chain." She counted. At the 11th bell, Hassel entered the private passage. She knew this because the stone told her. The small vibration of a specific weight on a specific floor section, a technique her engineers had spent years developing and which relied on the particular acoustic properties of Blackthorn Palace's original construction. The heavy basalt foundation that conducted vibration with an efficiency that above-ground stone did not. She counted footsteps. She felt him reach the chamber. She felt the door. She felt the silence that followed, which was a specific kind of silence. The silence of someone moving very carefully through a space they believed to contain a sleeping target. She counted 60 seconds. She felt the motion of him leaving, fast, urgent, moving back through the passage at a different pace than he had entered. She pressed the stone again. 2 signals. Short and short. Confirmation received. Track him. Somewhere in the palace's outer network, 3 of her people were already moving. Not to intercept, not yet. To observe the transmission, to follow the chain from Hassel's contact point to wherever Vane received confirmation, and from Vane's location upward to the contact above him. She breathed. She pressed her back against the cool stone of the service passage and let herself be still for exactly 30 seconds, which was the amount of stillness she permitted herself in the middle of an operation. Then she moved. She needed to reach Dawson's position before Vane sent his confirmation upward, because the moment that confirmation moved, the window was open and she had minutes before it closed. She was 3 corridors away and moving at a pace that looked, to the single guard she passed in the secondary service hall, like a servant in a hurry for a perfectly ordinary reason. A dropped tray recovered from the kitchen, a message delayed in delivery, the small urgent errands of palace life that happened at all hours. The guard barely glanced at her. She was 14 seconds from Dawson's position when she heard the sound. Not from the direction she expected. Not from the private wing passage, where Hassel would have been moving. From the council corridor to her left, which was not on Vane's usual path and should not have contained anyone at this hour. A voice. Vane's voice. And then another voice. A voice she had not yet heard, low and completely controlled, with an accent that placed its speaker's origins in the capital district, old money, the kind of voice that was born already knowing it would be obeyed. She stopped. She was pressed against the wall of the junction, and around the corner of that junction, 12 feet away, Castor Vane was speaking to someone in the council corridor, and that someone was not in her map. That someone was not in any of her maps. She pulled the notebook from her hem. She wrote the voice's distinctive pattern, the particular rhythm of the consonants, the flattening of the long vowels, the way she had learned to transcribe acoustic data in darkness, by memory and texture years ago. She listened. She heard Vane say, "It's done." She heard the other voice say 4 words in response. 4 words. And the cold that moved through her was not the cold of the stone against her back. It was the cold of understanding something she had not understood before. Something that rewrote the past 11 months in a single, complete stroke. All of it. The territory. The ceasefire. The burning of Ashcroft. The reason the Shadowfang had been buried and hunted and driven underground. All of it collapsed into the meaning of those 4 words. She pressed the stone. Hard. 3 times. The signal for, "Everyone alert. Something has changed." Then she moved around the corner. Because the person standing with Vane in the council corridor was someone she recognized, not from her intelligence work, not from her network's reports or her 11 months of patient mapping. From before. From the world that existed before Silvermarsh. From a face she had believed was dead. The face belonged to a dead man. Celine's operational mind registered the contradiction before anything else could reach her. Not shock, not grief, just the cold, factual collision between confirmed intelligence and present reality. She had received confirmation of Aldrich Sorn's death 14 months ago through 3 independent channels. She had processed it in the 40 seconds she allowed herself for things she could not afford to grieve fully. She had moved forward. She had been wrong. Commander Aldrich Sorn stood in the council corridor with his hands clasped behind his back and the unhurried ease of a man entirely familiar with this building. 51 years old. Silver-streaked hair, the long jaw and the specific posture of someone who had spent 4 decades standing in front of people who needed to believe he was the most capable person in any given room. He had been the Shadowfang's chief strategist for a decade. He had trained half her officers. He had sat across a fire from her in the ruins of a valley during the Eastern Campaign and told her that loyalty was the only currency that didn't devalue. She had believed him completely. She pressed her back against the wall, and in the next 6 seconds, she rebuilt 11 months of intelligence from the foundation. The network that burned Ashcroft, the Myrath Alliance correspondence. Vane, a middle link. She had always known Vane was a middle link, and she had been patient, and she had mapped upward toward the architect with everything she had. The architect was Sorn. He had built the network while standing inside hers. And the timing of Ashcroft's destruction was not an external attack. It was a controlled demolition. The soldiers she had never been able to fully account for, 30 to 40% of the Legion's strength, flagged as missing rather than confirmed dead, they weren't missing. They were reassigned, transferred through the kind of slow, bureaucratic erosion that was invisible if you were looking for a dramatic event. He had spent years hollowing the command structure beneath her and filling it with his own people, and she hadn't seen it because she had trusted him, and trust was the wall you couldn't see through. She had 1,200 soldiers positioned throughout this city. How many of them were actually hers? The question hit her chest like cold water. She let it land. Then she set it aside because the corridor in front of her required everything she currently had. Sorn's head tilted slightly, the listening posture she recognized from 100 briefings. "Celine," he said. Quiet, conversational. The tone of a man who has known for some time that someone is around the corner. She came around the junction. She stood at the intersection and looked at him across 12 feet of torch-lit stone, and she kept her face the way she kept it in every room where the wrong expression got people killed. He looked at her the way she now understood he had always been looking at her. "You move better in a palace than I expected," he said. "I built in a 40-day margin for you to get here. You did it in 6. A pause. "I should have built in 30. She wrote and held up the notebook. "You burned Ashcroft." "I consolidated resources," he said. "The distinction matters to the people involved. It doesn't change the strategic outcome." She wrote, "You killed my people. 43 confirmed dead at Silvermarsh," he said, with the flat precision of someone correcting a mathematical error. "The rest are functional. Reassigned, but functional." He studied her. "You've been counting your assets since you arrived. The number is smaller than you believe. I need you to understand the actual shape of the board before we discuss what comes next. There are people who build loyalty through obligation, debt, fear, proximity to power, the rational calculation that alignment with strength is safer than opposition. The machinery runs. Results are measurable. It is not a contemptible model. And then there are people who build loyalty through genuine investment, who spend years learning what the people around them need, who make themselves indispensable not through coercion, but through accurate understanding. These people are more dangerous because the loyalty they create bypasses the part of the mind that can be reasoned with. It is felt. It is chosen. And when it is revealed as a mechanism rather than a truth, the damage it leaves behind is not the clean damage of betrayal by an enemy. It is the specific devastation of having given yourself to something that was a design. Celine had built the Shadowfang on trust earned over years. She had believed completely that the trust ran in both directions. She wrote, "What do you want?" "What I've always wanted," he said. "A force that can do what the Shadowfang was built to do. Without the limitations." She wrote, "The limitations being me, the limitations being loyalty to a system already collapsing when we joined it." He moved to the wall where a torch bracket cast the corridor in hard orange. The Lycan territories have been fracturing for 30 years. The peace treaties are paper. The alliances are performed. The kingdoms exchanging formal delegations in the daylight have been building military capacity in the dark for a generation. He looked at her directly. The Shadow Fang was created to operate in the space between what powers admit and what they actually do. I've extended that operation to its logical conclusion. She wrote, "You're building for Mirath. I'm building for whoever creates the next stable order. At present, that appears to be the Mirath Alliance. If Noctara had moved first, I would be building for Noctara." She looked at him for a moment. Then she wrote, "The assassination tonight. What does a dead king give Mirath that a living one doesn't? A destabilized court without clear succession. 3 months of internal conflict while 6 noble houses compete. A military that is excellent in the field and leaderless at the political level." He paused. "A door." She wrote, "The attempt failed." Something moved through his expression. Hassel reported confirmation. She wrote, "Hassel reported what the room contained, not what the room was." 3 seconds of silence. She watched him work through it. He arrived at the conclusion fast. He had always been fast. "You've been here longer than 6 days," he said. Then, "The stone resonance, engineers in the structure before you arrived." He looked at the wall beside him, as though seeing it differently. 11 months. A pause that was not quite admiration and not quite its opposite. "I built in 40 days. I should have built in a year." Okay. Raiden came around the East Passage junction 4 minutes later and stopped. He took in the corridor. He took in Celine. He took in Sorn. The assessment moved across his face, fast, professional, and what emerged when it finished was controlled, but not fully controlled. Not surprise. Something older than surprise. "Sorn," he said. Celine went still. "Your Majesty." Sorn inclined his head. "I was beginning to think you'd send Dawson. I prefer to read rooms myself." "I know. I've been counting on it." They knew each other. Not as strangers, not as king and distant court contact. The weight of history was in the corridor with them, the specific gravity of 2 people who had occupied the same space through significant events and come out understanding things about each other that were not in any official record. "How long?" Raiden said. 11 years, since the Halvern negotiation." Raiden's jaw tightened. "You were the source, the intelligence that closed the Northern Border Agreement. Fed to Dawson because it was accurate and because the Northern closing served my purposes at the time. Good intelligence serves multiple parties. That is what makes it good. And the Mirath correspondence? Also accurate. Also fed deliberately through a channel I knew you'd intercept." The corridor went very quiet. Celine wrote and held the notebook where both men could see it. "You brought him here. You needed Raiden in this corridor tonight." Sorn looked at it. Something shifted in his face. The first genuine shift since she'd come around the corner. "She's faster than she was," he said, as though recording a fact. Then to Raiden, "Yes, I needed you here. Not for an assassination. That was always a mechanism, never an objective. I needed you in a room with her, with the full picture visible, because neither of you would take the next step without it." "The next step," Raiden said. "The Mirath Alliance launches its full military operation in 9 days." He said it the way people said things that were technically calm and practically catastrophic. Not the border skirmish your northern reports describe. The full operation. 3 allied armies, coordinated western, northern, and sea approaches simultaneously. The intelligence Dawson has is approximately 40% of the actual scope. I removed the rest from what he received. Dawson, from the passage mouth, made a sound that was not quite a word. Raiden did not move. "Why?" "Because 40% of the scope requires an aggressive but manageable military response. 100% requires something neither your armies alone nor the Shadowfang alone can provide." Sorn looked at Celine, then at Raiden. "I have spent 11 years arranging this room. A king who understands that dominance without strategy is simply expensive casualties. A commander whose operational depth has no parallel in this territory. A threat large enough to make the alliance between them not a political choice but a survival requirement." Celine stared at him. She wrote with hard-pressed strokes. "You burned Ashcroft to force this." "I burned Ashcroft to force you underground," he said. "If the Shadowfang had remained visible, you would have been absorbed into Noctaran military command years ago." useful, controllable, diminished. He said the last word with a precision that indicated he had thought about it for a very long time. What you built in the dark, with no resources, no authority, nothing but your own capability, that is the force that can meet what is coming. I could not have built it for you. You had to build it yourself, and you had to believe you were building it for your own reasons. She threw the notebook, not at him, at the wall. The compact, precise violence of someone who has decided the controlled performance is finished. It hit stone and cracked against it and fell, and the sound was very loud in the corridor. Raiden looked at her. She stood with her hands at her sides, and something moving behind her eyes that was past fury and past grief and into the territory that exists on the other side of both. The cold, absolute place where a person has been taken completely apart and is standing in the aftermath deciding what to rebuild. 43 dead at Silvermarsh. The rest scattered, operating under a command structure she had believed was hers. 11 months of work built on a foundation designed by someone else. She was the most capable tactical mind in the Lycan territories, and she had been played, not through carelessness, not through missed signals, but by a man who knew her better than anyone living and had used that knowledge with the precision of a craftsman. And he was right. That was the unbearable part. She could see, with the same clarity that made her exceptional at this, that he was right. The force she had assembled in the dark was not the force she could have built in the light. The 11 months had cost 43 lives and the stability of everything she had constructed, and they had produced something nothing else would have produced. She knew this. She stood with the knowledge of it and the rage of it at the same time. Raiden bent and picked up the notebook. He set it against the wall carefully. He looked at Sorn. 9 days, he said. What do you want from tonight? Formal operational autonomy for the Shadowfang under its commander, Sorn said. Not as an auxiliary to your military structure, as an independent force operating in coordination, parallel authority, neither subordinate to the other. In exchange, every contact in the Mirath Alliance network, every name, every position, every operational timeline I have built across 11 years. And Vayne. Vayne is yours. And the soldiers you redirected. That conversation belongs to her, Sorn said. Not to you. Raiden looked at Celine. She was already looking at Sorn. The quality of that look was something Raiden had no vocabulary for yet. Not the assessment he had learned to read on her face, not the controlled performance. This was the face of someone standing at the exact edge of what they can carry. Not breaking, but feeling the full weight of it for the first time because there was no longer any operational reason to hold it at a distance. She picked up the notebook and the pencil from where it had fallen beside it. She wrote for 30 seconds, held it up for Raiden. Parallel authority, independent operational command. No absorption into Noctaran military structure. And when this war is finished and the territory is stable, the Shadowfang is released from all Noctaran obligation. No permanent alliance, no standing treaty. We operate independently, without royal sanction required, ever. Raiden read it. He looked at her above the edge of the paper. She had been purchased at a public auction 6 days ago. That paper still existed in a commission office in Thalvane City. Technically, legally, she was his property. He said, agreed. She held his gaze for one moment. Then she looked at Sorn and wrote one more line. She held it up only for him. When this is over, I'm coming back for you. Sorn read it. For the first time in the corridor, something entered his face that was not calculation. It might have been the closest thing to remorse he was capable of producing. He inclined his head. She put the notebook in her hem, and the palace shook. Not the rolling groundswell of shifting earth. Something sharper. The percussion signature of an explosion, distant but massive, from the direction of the northern gate. The torch brackets rattled. A thin crack ran up the wall plaster beside the window. Dawson moved to the corridor's north window and looked out, and what he saw drained the professional neutrality from his face entirely. The northern garrison, he said. His voice was very flat. It's burning. Raiden was already moving. Celine was moving in a different direction, her palm finding the stone in the wall as she went. Hard, 3 times, twice, then once. Every signal she had, full activation. Sorn stood still in the corridor behind them. 9 days? He said to neither of them in particular. I was wrong about 9 days. The war had not waited. The war had already started, and the board Sorn had spent 11 years arranging had just been kicked over by the force it was designed to stop. And every calculation made in this corridor was now running on a timeline that belonged to the enemy. Celine stopped at the junction. She did not look back at Sorn. She pressed the stone one final time. Slow, deliberate. The signal she had not used in 11 months. The one that meant all positions, all assets, all authority transferred to active command. Whatever portion of her legion was truly hers would move. Whatever portion was not, she would find out on the battlefield. That was the only accounting left. The northern garrison burned with the particular thoroughness of a fire that was set by people who understood fire. Not the chaotic spread of an accident, not the opportunistic crawl of an ember catching dry timber. This was architectural burning, the kind that identified load-bearing points and structural vulnerabilities and addressed them in sequence so that what collapsed first would compromise what stood adjacent, and what compromised what stood adjacent would bring down the wall section beyond that. And by the time the garrison soldiers understood the geometry of what was happening to them, the geometry was already irreversible. Celine understood this from the window of the East Tower where she had positioned herself in the 3 minutes since the first explosion, and what she understood from it was that the force that had planned this attack had been studying Blackthorn Palace's defensive infrastructure for at minimum 6 months, possibly longer. She pressed her palm against the stone. The response came back in 4 seconds. A vibration pattern she felt through the bones of her hand transmitted through 80 feet of basalt foundation from the contact point in the lower service passage. The pattern said, Northern approach, 2 formations, estimated 800 in the first wave, heavy siege equipment, moving faster than standard assault doctrine would predict. Faster because they had not planned for resistance at the garrison. The garrison had already been compromised before the fire started. Someone inside had opened the northern approach. She felt the secondary vibration that came after the first. It said, There is a third formation. It is not coming from the north. She pressed once, hard, the question's signal. The response came back slowly, which meant the operator on the other end was uncertain, which meant the situation was outside the parameters they had mapped together. The third formation was coming from beneath. Raiden found her at the East Tower window 60 seconds later, moving at the pace of a man who had been in enough collapsing situations to have learned that running communicated panic to everyone who saw it, and panic in a commander was a tactical liability. He came with Stellan Dawson and a third figure she had not expected, Sorn, keeping pace 3 steps behind Dawson, with the expression of a man who had released his plan to the current and was now navigating whatever the current produced. North Garrison is gone, Raiden said. He came to the window and looked out, and his face in the firelight was the face of a man doing a very fast and very painful accounting. What do you have? She pressed the stone in the window frame and felt the response, and wrote on the notebook and held it up. 2 surface formations from the north, approximately 800 first wave. A third formation coming from the underground approach. The old aqueduct system under the east quarter. Someone gave them the maps. Raiden read it. He looked at Dawson. Dawson had the expression of a man who had already identified the someone. The records office, he said quietly. 3 weeks ago. A junior archivist requested the original construction surveys, standard preservation review. I cleared it. You cleared it, Raiden said. Yes. Dawson's voice was flat in the way it went flat when he was performing the specific function of not allowing what he felt to interfere with what needed to happen next. I cleared it. Sorn spoke from behind them. The aqueduct formation is not the primary threat. It's the diversion. The surface assault draws your defensive positioning north. The aqueduct force comes up inside the inner wall through the service cistern access in the east courtyard. By the time your garrison reorients, the inner wall is already contested. Everyone in the room looked at him. I know the plan, he said, with the flat patience of someone stating an obvious fact, because I helped design it. 6 months ago, before I decided the timeline was wrong. A pause. I told them 9 days. They moved without telling me. Why? Raiden said. Because they stopped trusting me when they realized I was in communication with someone inside your palace. He looked at Celine. They didn't know it was her. They thought I had been turned. The silence that followed was brief and had a great deal of weight in it. Celine wrote, How many in the aqueduct formation? 400, Specialized close quarters unit. They've trained in the tunnel system for 3 months. He paused. The cistern access is in the east courtyard. You have approximately 20 minutes before they reach it. Raiden looked at Celine. She was already writing. She held up the notebook. 12 words. I need control of the east courtyard and the cistern. Give me the order. It's yours, he said. She pressed the stone 4 times in rapid sequence. Oh, what happened in the next 4 hours was not the kind of warfare that gets remembered cleanly. Clean warfare was a story told after the fact by people who had not been inside it, who assembled the movements of armies into coherent narratives with identifiable turning points and decisive moments and the satisfying arc of a situation that moved from chaos to resolution. The reality of those hours inside Blackthorn's walls was not a narrative. It was a series of simultaneous, partially visible crises that required decisions made on incomplete information in physical conditions that steadily degraded the capacity of every person involved to make good decisions. The East Courtyard fell under Shadowfang control in 11 minutes, not because the operation went cleanly. It did not. 2 of Celine's people reached the cistern access 20 seconds after the first aqueduct soldiers emerged from it, which was 20 seconds later than the plan required, and the contact that followed in the dark of the courtyard's lower level was the particular violence of people fighting in a space too small and too dark for anything but the most basic physical calculus of who was standing and who was not. Celine was in the courtyard. This was not the plan. The plan had her at the command position in the East Tower, managing the signal architecture, coordinating the 3-point defensive response. The plan assumed the cistern team would seal the access before the aqueduct formation cleared it. The plan had 20 seconds of error margin and used them. She went into the courtyard because the alternative was watching from a tower window while people she had trained died because the plan was 20 seconds short, and the alternative was something she was constitutionally incapable of choosing regardless of what the operational logic recommended. She had no blade. She had the stone wall of the courtyard and the understanding of exactly how many people were in the space and where they were standing, transmitted through the vibration of the flagstones beneath her feet. And she had 11 months of accumulated rage that had been stored with the same careful discipline as everything else, and was now available for deployment. She moved through that courtyard in the dark, and the firelight from the north with the specific economy of motion that came from having done difficult things in difficult conditions for long enough that the body stopped deliberating and simply acted. She was not large. She was not the strongest person in that space. What she was, in those minutes in the East Courtyard, was the person who knew exactly where everyone else was and moved accordingly, and that was sufficient. Raiden saw her from the East Tower. He saw her the way he had seen her in the gallery on the 6th day. The recognition of something operating at a frequency that didn't match its container. She was a lean woman in a servant's gray tunic fighting in a courtyard full of armored soldiers. And she was winning not because she was stronger, but because she was 3 decisions ahead of everyone else in the space. And she moved through the consequences of those decisions with the unhurried precision of someone walking a path they had already mapped. He stood at the tower window for 4 seconds. Then he went down. Stell said, "Your Majesty." "With me," Raiden said. The northern wall held through the first wave, largely because the Shadowfang soldiers embedded in the city's outer districts had been moving since the first signal, filtering into position through the network of service passages and outer approaches that Celine had mapped in the first 3 weeks of her palace access. They arrived not as a visible force, but as a series of small, coordinated disruptions, pressure on the northern formation's flanks that wasn't sufficient to stop them, but was sufficient to slow them, to complicate their approach geometry, to force redeployments that cost time. Time was the resource. Everything in the next 4 hours was a negotiation for time. Time for the palace garrison to reorient from the garrison loss. Time for the Shadowfang to consolidate position. Time for the aqueduct threat to be sealed before it became the fulcrum on which the entire defense broke. General Torvek arrived from the northern barracks at the 2nd hour with 400 palace soldiers and the expression of a man who had received orders he did not fully understand from a chain of command that had apparently been reorganized in the last 90 minutes without his input. He found Raiden in the inner courtyard with a working blade and a split across the left side of his jaw where a crossbow bolt fragment had caught him during the East Tower descent. and he found a woman in a servant's tunic standing at the wall junction with her hand pressed to the stone and Doson beside her writing down what she transmitted. "What?" Torvik said. "The east cistern is sealed," Raiden said. "North formation is in the outer yard. They have siege equipment, but not enough wall clearance yet. We have 20 minutes to reposition your 400 to the north secondary gate before they bring the equipment forward." Torvik looked at the woman. At Doson. At the king. "Sir," he said carefully, "is that a servant?" "She's the reason you still have a north secondary gate to defend," Raiden said. "Move your people." Torvik moved his people. There are commanders who lead through the management of information, who maintain the elevated perspective, the strategic overview, the deliberate distance from the point of contact that allows them to see the whole board, while those at the front see only their immediate situation. This is a discipline. It requires the suppression of every instinct that says proximity is survival, that the safest place is where you can see the threat directly rather than receiving it secondhand through reports and signals. Raiden had been that kind of commander for 15 years. What he was doing tonight was not that. He was in the inner courtyard and then the north secondary gate, and then the east passage, and he was present for every crisis point as it developed rather than managing from remove. And the reason for this was not tactical brilliance. The reason was simpler and more fundamental. He could not translate what she was transmitting through the stone without being close enough to receive it in real time. She was the map. He was the force that moved on what the map showed. It was the most efficient command structure he had operated inside in 30 years of warfare, and it worked because both elements understood their function and executed without negotiating the division of authority at every decision point. There was no time to negotiate. There was only the next 20 seconds, and then the 20 seconds after that, and the accumulated survival of 20-second intervals was what the defense of a palace looked like from the inside. But the second wave arrived at the third hour. It was larger than the first. Not the 800 of the initial assault, but something closer to 1,500 reorganized and reinforced, coming with the momentum of a force that had sustained the first wave's attrition and absorbed it, and was now pressing the advantage of superior numbers against a defense that was showing the seams of 4 hours of continuous crisis. The Shadowfang soldiers in the outer positions had been fighting for 3 hours. They were not broken. Celine's people did not break in the way that conventionally trained forces broke, because they had been selected and trained specifically for the capacity to continue operating past the point where the physical and psychological conditions of combat would ordinarily degrade performance to ineffectiveness. But they were tired in the real way that bodies become tired when they have been sustaining maximum output for extended duration. And tired bodies made small errors, and small errors in a contested space accumulated into larger ones. Celine felt this through the stone. The signal patterns were coming back slightly slower than they had been at the operation's start. Not dangerously slow. But the margin was compressing. She was at the north secondary gate when the second wave's vanguard made contact with the outer wall, and the sound of it was the particular layered percussion of a large force in coordinated assault, the battering of siege equipment against stone, the sharper sound of crossbow volleys, the specific register of a large number of people moving fast across a contested surface. Raiden was beside her. He had been beside her for the last 2 hours, which was an arrangement that had not been formally decided and that neither of them had commented on. He was useful. That was the accurate assessment. His presence in any contested space changed the behavior of every Nocturne soldier in it, not through command, because there was rarely time for command, but through the simpler mechanism of a king who was present and fighting, which communicated to everyone around him that the situation was survivable and worth surviving in a way that no formal order could replicate. He was also, she had noted, very good, not decorated good. Functionally good, in the way of someone who had learned combat in conditions where performance was immediately tested against real consequences. He moved without waste. He made decisions at the correct speed, fast enough to be ahead of developing situations, not so fast that he was responding to what he expected rather than what was actually happening. He watched the space in the same way she watched it, with the 360 awareness of a person who had learned that the threat you focused on was rarely the threat that killed you. They had not spoken in 2 hours. They had communicated constantly, through the stone, through gesture, through the shorthand of two people who had been operating in close proximity under pressure long enough to develop a shared vocabulary of motion and attention. She would press the stone and he would read her face and move. He would identify a position shift and look at her, and she would confirm with a single nod or redirect with a small angle of her head. It was not a system they had designed. It was a system that had emerged from necessity, which was the only way systems worth using actually came into being. The second wave broke against the north secondary gate at the third hour's midpoint, and Raiden held the gate with Torvik's 480 of Seleni's people, and it was not clean and it was not without cost. 3 of Torvik's soldiers died in the first 8 minutes of that contact. One of Selene's, a man she had trained herself 4 years ago in a valley in the Eastern Territories, took a bolt through the shoulder and kept the position he was holding for another 6 minutes before Selene physically removed him from it and put someone else there. She pressed his face between her palms for 1 second before she left him. He would live. The shoulder was bad, but the angle was wrong for anything vital. He would live, and she had work to do, and she released him and went back to the wall. The gate held. It was at the 4th hour that Malachar Voss revealed himself. She had known he was coming. Sorn's intelligence, delivered in fragments over the course of the night's first 3 hours, in the brief intervals when Sorn positioned himself near enough to transmit, had included Voss as the operational commander of the Alliance force, former warlord, architect of the campaign structure. The man who had assembled 3 kingdoms under a single military objective through a combination of shared interest, strategic coercion, and the particular genius of someone who understood that the most durable alliances were the ones built on mutual necessity rather than mutual affection. She had known he was commanding from the field. She had not known he would take the field himself. He came at the 4th hour's start through the outer gate that the second wave had finally breached, not at the head of his forces in the theatrical fashion of commanders who led with spectacle, but at the center of them, which was the position of a man who moved inside his army the way a fist moved inside a glove, shaped by it and shaping it simultaneously. He was visible from the north secondary gate as a figure in black field armor, unhelmeted, with the particular economy of motion that marked people who had been doing this for a very long time. He stopped in the outer yard and looked at the north secondary gate. He was too far for his expression to be readable. He raised one hand. The second wave, which had been sustaining pressure against the gate for 40 minutes, pulled back. Not retreating. Pulling back to a specific position, the kind of positioning that happened when a force was creating space for something different to enter the space it had just vacated. Selene pressed the stone in the gate wall and felt what was behind the second wave. She pressed Raiden's arm. He looked at her. She held up 3 fingers, then moved her hand in the pattern that indicated heavy, not soldiers, equipment, or animals, then pointed north and swept her arm wide. He understood. He turned to Torvik. Pull the front line back to the inner gate, now. Torvik had been through enough by this point to have stopped asking for explanations. He pulled the line back. The outer yard cleared, and Voss's reserve came through the breach. Not additional soldiers, but something that had not been in any of the intelligence Dawson had assembled, something that Sorn's 40% redaction had apparently included. 4 massive siege engines, disassembled for transport through the tunnel system and reassembled in the outer yard over the past 2 hours, while the surface assault held the garrison's attention north. Designed not for walls. The trajectory angle was wrong for wall assault, designed for interior positions once the outer gate was breached. Selene looked at the engines and felt the cold of understanding run through her in one complete wave. They had not come to take the palace. They had come to destroy it. A dead king was a door. A destroyed palace was a statement, the kind of statement that traveled ahead of an advancing army and reached the next target before the army did, that communicated not just military capacity but intent, the specific intent of a force that was not interested in conquest and administration, but in the elimination of existing power structures entirely. Voss was not building an empire. He was clearing ground for one. The distinction was the difference between a war that ended in occupation and a war that ended in ash. She pressed the stone 4 times, hard. The response came back in 3 seconds. Her people in the outer positions were already moving, but the movement was happening too slowly. The fatigue of 4 hours was in their legs and their decisions, and the siege engines were faster to deploy than she had calculated because they had been partly pre-assembled in the tunnel before emergence. Raiden was beside her. "Tell me," he said. She took the notebook. She wrote 2 lines. She held it up. They're not here for occupation. They want nothing standing, and I'm short on the outer positions by 4 minutes. He read it. He read it twice. He looked at the outer yard where Voss stood inside his army, and the siege engines were coming to their operational positions, and something moved across Raiden's face in that moment that she had not seen there before. Not fear, not calculation, something more fundamental. The look of a man who has stripped away everything he thought he knew about what he was willing to do, and has arrived at the bedrock of it and found it simpler and harder than he expected. He had spent 15 years building an empire through dominance. He had measured the worth of his decisions by their strategic outcomes. He had held himself at the managed remove of a ruler who understood that the coordinate point had to be protected because the system oriented by it. He looked at the outer yard. He looked at her. "How many of your people are in the outer positions?" he said. She held up both hands. 7 fingers. 7. 7 Shadowfang soldiers holding the outer positions against the reserve force and the repositioning of the second wave, buying the 4 minutes that the operation needed to seal the siege engine deployment before it reached operational range. 7 people buying 4 minutes. He knew what that meant. She knew what it meant. They both knew what happened to 7 people buying 4 minutes against those numbers. "Call them back," he said. She shook her head. "Celine," his voice was very even. "Call them back. We'll find another 4 minutes." She looked at him and she wrote one line and held it up. "There is no other 4 minutes, and they know what they signed for." He looked at the paper. He looked at her. And then he did something she had not calculated. He took the notebook out of her hand and put it in his coat. He stepped past her. "Stell," he said, "with me." "Sir?" "I said with me." She grabbed his arm. He stopped. He looked at her hand on his arm and then at her face, and the look they exchanged in that moment was not the look of a commander and a tactical asset. It was the look of 2 people who have been in a foxhole together long enough that the professional distance has become a kind of fiction. They have both stopped maintaining, and both of them knew it, and neither of them had time to address what that meant. 4 minutes, he said. "That's all I need from your people. I'll give them the 4 minutes." She did not release his arm. He looked at her with the absolute steadiness of a man who has made a decision and is not reversing it. "I have been letting other people buy me time," he said, "since I was 22 years old, and I took a throne that wasn't handed to me. I am done letting other people buy me time." She released his arm, not because she agreed with the decision, because she understood it, because she had made the same kind of decision herself, in that courtyard 4 hours ago, when she went in without a blade because the alternative was watching from a tower while people she had trained died for 20 seconds of margin. She had made that decision, and she understood what it cost, and she understood why it was unmovable once it was made. She pressed his arm once. Then she stepped back. She pressed the stone in the wall, the signal that said, "Hold, 4 minutes. Hold." Raiden moved into the outer yard. What followed was the kind of thing that built the stories that outlasted the people who generated them. Not because it was elegant, or because it resolved cleanly, or because it had the satisfying geometry of a planned operation, but because it was a single man walking into the outer yard of a contested palace at the 4th hour of a night battle to draw the attention of a warlord's reserve force, and he did it with the specific, unhurried quality of someone who understood exactly what he was doing and had decided it was worth doing. Voss saw him immediately. The outer yard went strange for a moment, the specific strangeness of a contested space when the thing happening in it is outside the parameters of what the participants expected. Soldiers on both sides registered the king in the yard, and the information moved through the formation the way information moves through a crowd. Fast, uneven, producing different responses in different positions. Voss raised a hand again. His force held. He walked forward. Not to close the full distance. He stopped 30 feet out, the position of a man who was making himself available for conversation without committing to proximity. "Drakkar," he said. His voice was the voice of someone who had been doing this for 40 years. Flat, functional, no performance in it. "Voss?" Raiden's voice had the same quality. "You moved early." "My timeline was adjusted." "By who?" A pause. "That's no longer relevant." "Sorn told you 9 days," Raiden said. "You moved without him, which means you don't trust him anymore." Voss looked at him. I don't trust anyone who has been in communication with my target's palace for 11 months. Smart. Raiden rolled his left shoulder, the motion of a man settling his body into a position it had occupied before. Then you understand why I'm not going to let you put those engines in range of my inner wall. You're one man, Voss said. Tonight I've been working with a force that spent 11 months invisible in my own palace without my knowledge. I've revised my understanding of what one person represents. He looked at the engines, then back at Voss. You and I could do this with the armies. It's going to cost you more than you've budgeted, but you could do it. Or you could do it the way that ends faster. A duel, Voss said. Your engineers need 4 minutes to get those engines to range. I'm offering you 4 minutes of something more interesting. The outer yard was very quiet. Celine at the north secondary gate had her hand pressed to the stone and her eyes on Raiden's back and her jaw set with the particular tightness of someone who is watching a calculation unfold that they did not design and cannot control. She felt through the stone. Her 7 people in the outer positions were holding. They had heard the exchange. They were holding. She pressed the signal, hold. She felt it come back, holding. Voss looked at Raiden for a long moment. 4 minutes, he said. He drew his blade. Raiden drew his, and the outer yard of Blackthorn Palace became, for 4 minutes, the smallest and most consequential battlefield of the night. Voss was a warlord who had been fighting in active campaigns for 4 decades, and he fought with the unhurried technical precision of someone who had encountered every style, every approach, every strategic personality that combat produced, and had developed responses to all of them. He was not fast in the way young fighters were fast. He was something harder to manage. He was accurate, and he was patient, and he read movement the way readers read text, with a comprehension that ran ahead of the present moment and positioned for what was coming rather than what was currently happening. He was very good. Raiden was better. Not because he was technically superior. On pure technical grounds, it was close enough that the margin would have been invisible to most observers. He was better because he fought in the way she had identified in the gallery on the 6th day, the way she had watched him fight in the inner courtyard and the north secondary gate across 4 hours of continuous contact. He fought with the quality of a man who had no abstract investment in the outcome, who was not managing his performance or aware of being watched or calibrating his output to the audience. He was simply present, in the space, in the moment, in the specific physical negotiation of 2 people applying their full capability to the question of who was going to be standing at the end of it. There is a quality in human beings that does not emerge under ordinary conditions. It does not emerge from comfort or from safety, or from the managed distances of a life that has been successfully protected from the full weight of consequence. It emerges specifically and only from the moment when everything else has been stripped away, when there is no strategy left to execute, no plan left to run, no margin left to work inside. And what remains is the bedrock of what a person actually is, without any of the scaffolding of position or authority or capability that ordinarily surrounds it. This was the quality Raiden brought to the outer yard in the 4th hour of the night's battle. Not the king, not the alpha of Noctara, not the commander or the ruler or the figure that 15 years of governance had made him. The man who had decided that this was worth standing in. 2 minutes into the exchange, Voss put a cut across Raiden's right forearm. Deep enough to matter. Not deep enough to cost the arm. Raiden registered it in the way experienced fighters registered damage. Noted, filed, adjusted for. He did not pull back. He did not change tempo. 3 minutes in, Raiden took the initiative in a way that Voss had not anticipated. Not a technical shift, but a spatial one, using the courtyard's uneven flagstone surface in a way that required prior knowledge of it, knowledge that came from having spent 4 hours moving in and out of this space in the dark and building the kind of 3-dimensional map that the body compiled automatically when survival depended on it. Voss lost a step. Raiden took it. The exchange in the next 30 seconds was not clean, and it was not elegant, and both of them were bleeding from multiple contact points, and the flagstones beneath them were wet in the torchlight, and neither of them was operating at the full capacity they had started with. At 3 minutes and 50 seconds, Celine felt through the stone what she had been waiting for. Her 7 people in the outer positions had completed the 4 minutes of holding. The Shadow Fang units from the Eastern Consolidation were in position at the outer yard's flanks. The siege engines were not yet at operational range. She pressed the stone. The signal said, "Now." The outer yard exploded. Not literally. The explosions were the coordinated movement of Shadowfang soldiers from 3 approach positions simultaneously, flooding the outer yard's flanks in a compression that drove Voss's reserve formation inward, away from the siege engines, away from the operational positions they needed to hold. Voss heard it. He looked away from Raiden for 1 second. 1 second. Raiden drove forward. What happened in that second was fast and final, and left Voss on the flagstones with Raiden's blade at his throat and the sound of his army reorganizing in a direction that was away from the palace rather than toward it. The outer yard went still. Celine came through the north secondary gate. She walked across the courtyard in the gray pre-dawn light that was beginning to define the edges of things, the walls, the towers, the dark shape of the mountains beyond the outer perimeter. And she walked toward Raiden where he stood over Voss, and she did not run, and she did not look at anything other than him, specifically at the arm, which was bleeding more than she would have preferred. She stopped beside him. She looked at Voss on the flagstones. She looked at Raiden. He was breathing hard. The controlled performance of the past 4 hours was gone from his face entirely, and what was underneath it was not the king. It was the man, with the blood and the sweat and the specific exhaustion of someone who has pushed completely past the boundary of what the body wants to do and has found, on the other side of that boundary, that the thing they were pushing toward was worth it. He looked at her. 4 minutes, he said. She held his gaze. She put her hand on his arm, not the wound, the upper arm, the clean part, and held it there. Just for a moment. Just one. And then from the east, from somewhere beyond the outer wall in the direction of the ashen plains that stretched between the palace and the mountain passes through which the Mirath Alliance forces were still moving, there was a sound that she recognized and that changed everything. A horn, not the Mirath horn pattern, not Noctara's, the Shadowfang signal, the horn that meant the full legion was mobilizing, not the unit she had activated inside the city, but the reserve she had not confirmed as hers. The soldiers she had not been certain of since Sorn's revelation in the corridor. The portion of the Legion's strength that she had spent the whole night not knowing. The horn said, "We are here, we came." She looked east, she looked at Raiden, and then, from the inner palace behind them, from the east passage where she had last seen him, came Cray Dawson moving at a pace that was not his usual pace. "There's someone at the outer gate," Dawson said. He was breathing. "Asking for the commander of the Shadowfang by name." He paused. "Not your name. The name before." She looked at him. "He says his name is Aldrich Sorn," Dawson said, "and he says he has 400 soldiers with him, and he says—" Dawson stopped. He looked at her with the flat, watchful eyes of a man delivering information he has not yet decided what to do with. "He says they're hers, if she'll have them." The ashen plains were lightening to the east. The horn was still sounding. Celine stood in the courtyard of Blackthorn Palace with Raiden's blood on her hand and the sound of her legion. The whole of it, or something closer to the whole of it than she had believed possible 4 hours ago, coming through the passes. She looked east. The final war was not over. It had not yet truly begun. But the pieces were all on the board now, and the board was hers to read, and she read it the way she read everything. Completely. Without sentiment, with the cold and absolute clarity of a woman who had been underestimated by everyone in this story and had spent every moment of that underestimation building toward this exact morning. She pressed the stone one final time. The signal said, "Advance." The horn sounded across the ashen plains as the first gray light of dawn pulled itself over the eastern ridge, and it did not sound like victory. It sounded like a question being answered after a very long time of not knowing if the answer would come. Celine stood at the outer gate of Blackthorn Palace and watched 400 soldiers emerge from the mountain pass in the particular ordered formation that was the Shadowfang's oldest tactical signature. Not the parade march of armies that wanted to be seen, but the functional compression of a force that moved to maximize response capability in any direction, that treated every open ground as potential contact, and every formation as a question about what the terrain required. She had designed that formation herself, 18 years ago, in the first winter she had spent understanding that the difference between a force that survived and a force that got spent was not strength or numbers, but the quality of thinking that happened between engagements. She had taught it to Aldrich Sorn. He had taught it to these 400. They moved like hers because they were hers, in the only sense that had ever mattered, trained in her doctrine, shaped by her principles, carrying in their bodies the accumulated knowledge of every campaign she had run and every lesson those campaigns had produced. Whatever Soren had redirected in their chain of command, whatever administrative architecture he had built above them without her knowledge, the soldiers themselves were the soldiers she had made. He walked at the front of them. He stopped 10 feet from the gate. She looked at him across that distance in the early gray light, with the accumulated weight of everything that had happened between the council corridor and this moment. And she did not move, and he did not move. And the 400 soldiers behind him and the Shadowfang units at her back held their positions with the professional stillness of people who understood that something was happening in the space between these two people that was not their business and was also the most important thing currently occurring. Soren looked tired, not the tactical exhaustion of a man who had been through a night of combat. He had not been in direct combat. The other kind of tired, the kind that came from carrying a long operation to its conclusion and arriving at the other side of it and finding that the other side was real and contained actual people in it, rather than the abstract variables the operation had required him to treat them as. He looked at Celine. He said nothing. She took the notebook from her hem. She wrote one line. She held it up. It said, "Did you know they would come?" He read it. He was quiet for a moment, then, "I hoped. I did not know." A pause that had considerable weight in it. "There is a difference, and I want you to understand that I understand the difference." She lowered the notebook. She looked at him for a long time. Then she stepped aside from the gate. It was not forgiveness. She did not have a signal for forgiveness, and she was not certain the thing she was doing constituted forgiveness, in any sense that the word usually carried. What it was a decision. The same kind of decision she had been making all night. The kind that required setting aside what she felt in favor of what the situation required, and what the people involved actually needed, which was not always the same thing as what justice looked like from a distance. He walked through the gate. He stopped beside her. "The Eastern Column," he said quietly. "They're regrouping in the second pass. They lost their field commander in the outer yard engagement. Without Voss directing the coordination, the three-army convergence plan loses its timing mechanism. They can still advance, but they cannot advance simultaneously." "How long?" Raiden said. He had come to stand on her other side, his arm wrapped with a field binding that Stell had applied badly and that she had already identified as insufficient but had not yet had time to address. 4 hours before the Eastern Column recovers enough to move. The Western Column is 6 hours out from the border minimum. The Sea Fleet received word of Voss's capture an hour ago through their signal network. Soren looked at Raiden directly. "They are waiting for orders from someone with the authority to give them. Voss is the only person in the Alliance structure with that authority." "Then they wait indefinitely," Raiden said. "They wait until someone in the Alliance Council decides to appoint a replacement. That process takes time. Political time, not military time." Soren looked back at the pass. "You have a window. It is not a comfortable window, but it exists." Celine was already pressing the stone in the gate post. Halt. The Battle of the Ashen Plains lasted 6 hours. It was not the apocalyptic collision that the night's events had seemed to be building toward. Not the three-army convergence that Voss had designed. Not the coordinated assault from 3 directions that would have required a fundamentally different kind of defense. What it was the engagement of a disorganized Eastern Column that had lost its command structure against a combined force of Nocturne military and Shadowfang Legion that had spent a night fighting together and had, in that night, developed the kind of operational coherence that years of formal alliance planning rarely produced. The Eastern Column had numbers. Celine had the map of how those numbers moved, transmitted through her soldiers' positions across the plain in the stone signal architecture that the Shadowfang had been refining for 30 years. She knew where the column was dense and where it was thin. She knew where the flanks were vulnerable and where the center was overcommitted. She knew, with a precision that no conventional intelligence operation could have matched in the time available, exactly where to apply pressure and exactly where to hold. Raiden commanded the Noctaran force. She commanded hers. They did not exchange orders. They did not negotiate tactical decisions. They moved on the same information, read the same map, and applied force in the same direction at the same moment. And the result was not a battle that was won through superior strength or superior numbers, but through the specific advantage of a command structure that had no lag in it. No time lost between the knowing and the doing, because the same intelligence reached both commanders simultaneously, and both commanders were capable of acting on it without requiring confirmation from the other. There is a principle in the mechanics of conflict, and in the mechanics of any situation that requires two people to act as one, that the most dangerous thing a partnership can possess is not compatible strength. Compatible strength is common. Two capable people can almost always combine their capacities in ways that are additive. What is rare, and what is therefore decisive when it appears, is compatible intelligence, the ability to receive the same information and arrive at the same response independently, without negotiation, because the way each person processes reality is sufficiently aligned that the conclusions converge. Celine had found this in her officers across years of operational work. She had found it twice in her life in the full form, the form where the alignment was deep enough that the partnership felt less like coordination and more like extension, where acting together was not more complicated than acting alone, but was simply acting with more capability than either person carried separately. She had not expected to find it here. She had not expected to find it with a king she had known for 12 days. She thought about this in the brief intervals the battle permitted for thinking, which were not many and were not long, and she noted it in the same way she noted everything, as information to be processed when there was time to process it, to be understood when understanding was possible, to be set aside without weight when neither of those was currently available. The eastern column broke at the battle's 6th hour, not in the catastrophic way of a force that had been destroyed, in the practical way of a force that had lost its purpose. Voss was captive. The three-army convergence was not happening. The Sea Fleet had not committed. The western column was not in range. Without the coordinated mechanism that made the operation coherent, the eastern column was a large number of soldiers a long way from home, fighting for an objective that had already failed. And soldiers who understood that their objective had already failed had a specific decision to make about the value of continuing to generate casualties in its service. The surrender came through the column's senior remaining officer, a general whose name Celine did not know and did not need to know. He rode to the Noctaron line under a flag that was not quite the formal surrender flag, but communicated the same information, and he spoke to Torvek, and Torvek came to Raiden, and Raiden made the decision in 30 seconds. Terms, not unconditional destruction. Celine registered this decision. She had not been certain what he would choose. She had assessed him across 12 days of close proximity, and she had developed an accurate model of his decision patterns and his values and the specific shape of his judgment. But she had not been certain what the full extremity of a won battle would produce in him. There were rulers who became something different in victory than they were in the process of achieving it, who found, on the far side of the cost of winning, a need to make that cost mean something through the magnitude of what they did with it. He chose terms. He chose the decision that cost him the satisfaction of absolute victory and gave him instead the harder, more durable outcome of a surrendered force that had been treated with sufficient dignity that it would not immediately reconstitute itself into the next war's first army. She put that in her model of him. It changed the model considerably. They brought Voss to the palace at midday. He walked in under his own authority, which was not a concession she had expected him to make. She had expected him to need to be carried, had expected the particular resistance of a man who had been a warlord for 4 decades exercising the last available form of defiance. Instead, he walked. Slowly, with the evidence of the night's combat visible on him, but under his own power and with the specific quality of a man who had made a decision about what the next portion of his life required and was executing it without theater. He stood in the throne room before Raiden, and he looked at Celine, where she stood to Raiden's right, and he said, "The Sea Fleet will stand down if I send the order. The Western Column will retreat to the border if I send the order." "I know," Raiden said. "I will send both orders in exchange for one condition." "Tell me the condition." Voss looked at him. "The network. Not just Vane, all of it. Every Nocturne noble who corresponded with the Mirath Alliance. Every general who sold intelligence. Every administrator who facilitated the movement of Alliance assets through the territory. All of them face formal accountability. Public process. Documented outcomes. He paused. Not because I care about your court's internal hygiene, because the people in those kingdoms who supported this campaign were told it was necessary, because Noctara was irredeemably corrupt and would never reform from within. I want to be able to tell them that was wrong. The throne room was very quiet. Raiden looked at him for a long moment. Done, he said. Voss nodded once. He sent the orders. The accountability process took 3 months. It was not a clean 3 months. It was not a process that moved in straight lines from identification to judgment to resolution. It moved the way truth moved through systems that had been built to obstruct it, sideways and slowly, and with considerable resistance from people who had considerable resources to apply to the problem of their own accountability. Castor Vane was the first. His trial before the Grand Assembly lasted 4 days and produced a record of 11 years of correspondence, financial transaction, and strategic facilitation that was so comprehensive and so thoroughly documented that the Assembly spent most of the 4 days simply receiving it rather than debating it. He had been meticulous, Vane. He had kept records of everything, which was the habit of a bureaucrat who trusted process and which turned out, in the specific context of treason proceedings, to be a catastrophically self-defeating quality. He received the full judgment. 11 others followed over the course of the 3 months. Some were nobles. Some were military officers. 2 were treasury administrators. One was a man who had been the palace's senior records keeper for 22 years, and who had been facilitating information transfers so gradually and through such mundane channels that he had apparently convinced himself over the years that what he was doing was not quite what it was. The process was public. Raiden had insisted on this against the recommendation of 4 of his 6 surviving council members, who argued with varying degrees of tactical nuance that public accountability generated instability and that the outcomes could be achieved more efficiently through private judgment. Raiden had listened to all 4 arguments. He had rejected all 4. The instability we're managing, he said, in the council session where this was decided, is not the instability of public knowledge. It is the instability of 11 years of private rot. You do not fix private rot with more privacy. The council had no response to this that was stronger than the statement itself. The process was public. And the public, which had been living inside the consequences of 11 years of private rot without knowing its source, the higher taxes, the degraded border security, the infrastructure that was underfunded because treasury funds were being redirected, the public attended the proceedings with the specific attention of people who were finding out why things had been wrong in ways they had felt but not been able to name. It did not produce simple catharsis. It produced something more complicated and more durable. The understanding, widely shared, that the system they lived inside was capable of examining itself. Not perfectly, not without cost, but capable. That was enough. It was more than enough. Yet, Soren stood before a different kind of accounting. Not the Grand Assembly, not a formal proceeding, a room in the East Tower, in the early evening of the 40th day after the battle, with Raiden and Dawson and Celine, and the particular quality of quiet that comes when the noise of events has finally subsided, and what is left is the actual conversation that the events were built around. He had spent the 40 days in a form of supervised liberty, not imprisoned, not free, occupying the specific category of a person whose situation had not yet been formally resolved because the people with the authority to resolve it had been occupied with other resolutions. He had cooperated with Dawson's documentation process completely, delivering everything he had promised, every network contact, every operational timeline, every piece of intelligence that he had accumulated across 11 years of simultaneous operation on multiple sides of the same conflict. It was, Dawson had told Raiden privately, the most comprehensive intelligence transfer he had ever processed. It was also, Dawson had added, in the tone he used when he was stating something that was both true and insufficient, entirely consistent with someone who had always intended to transfer it. He stood in the East Tower room, and he looked at Celine, and he did not perform anything. "I want to tell you something," he said. "Not a justification. I'm past the point of believing justification is available to me for what I did." He held her gaze. "What I want to tell you is the thing I did not tell you in the corridor, which I should have told you there and didn't, because I was still inside the operation, and inside the operation, truth was a resource to be managed." She held the notebook, but did not write. "I did not know you would survive Silvermarsh," he said. "That is the truth. I built the operation on the assumption that you had the capability to survive it and reconstruct, but I did not know. There is a version of what I did in which you don't come out of that holding facility, in which you don't rebuild the Legion in the dark, in which the network burns your territory and you don't come back from it." He paused. "I made a calculation that used your life as a variable, and I made it without your knowledge and without your consent. And the fact that the calculation produced an outcome that was good by some measures does not change what it was." The room was very quiet. "I know," Celine wrote and held it up. He read it. "The question I've been asking myself for 40 days, he said, is whether knowing it is enough, whether the acknowledgement changes anything." He looked at Raiden briefly, then back at her. "I don't think it does. I think the damage is the damage regardless of whether I understand it clearly. I think that's the thing people in my position usually get wrong. We believe that sufficient understanding of what we did constitutes some form of repair. It doesn't." She wrote, "What does constitute repair?" He was quiet for a long time. "I don't know, he said finally. "I genuinely don't know. I think that might be the most honest thing I've said in this room." She looked at him for a moment, then she wrote, "It is." She put the notebook down. She looked at Raiden. He looked at her. The decision was hers. It had always been hers. Raiden had made this clear in the 40 days since the battle, through the particular quality of his restraint, which was not the restraint of indifference, but of a man who understood that this specific accounting belonged to the person who had paid the specific cost of it. He had offered no opinion. He had not positioned himself as arbiter. He had waited, and she understood what the waiting cost a man like him, and she had filed that cost in the same place she had been filing other things about him for 40 days. She picked up the notebook. She wrote for 30 seconds. She held it up for Sorn. It said, "You are released from the obligation you created, not because what you did was acceptable, because I am not willing to carry the weight of an unresolved accounting for the rest of my operational life. You go. You take no authority over any Shadowfang asset, current or future. If I ever have cause to look for you again, you will know before I arrive. That is the only promise I will make you." He read it. He read it twice. When he looked up, his face had the quality she had seen for just a moment in the corridor, the thing that was close to remorse, more fully visible now that the operation was over and the professional structure around him had dissolved. He inclined his head. He left the room. She watched him go. There is a common misunderstanding about what strength requires of the people who carry it. The misunderstanding says that strength is the capacity to hold on, to maintain position, to sustain pressure, to endure without releasing. This is a description of endurance, which is a component of strength, but is not its definition. The deeper capacity, the one that the endurance serves, is the capacity to release at the correct moment, to understand when holding on has become its own form of damage, to let the weight go, not because it is easy or because it does not matter, but because the continued carrying of it is costing more than it is protecting. Celine had been carrying the weight of Silvermarsh for 14 months. She set it down. Not all of it. Some of it would be with her for a long time. The 43 names, the specific faces of the specific people, the sound of a valley she could not return to in the form it used to occupy. That was not weight she was choosing to set down. That was the kind of weight that became part of the architecture of a person, that shaped the structure without being separate from it. What she set down was the part that had been running on fury and forward motion and the particular cold engine of an unresolved accounting. She set it down. She breathed. The Grand Assembly convened 6 weeks after the battle. It was the largest assembly in Noctara's recorded history. Every noble house withstanding, every provincial governor, the military command structure, the guild representatives, and a section of the hall that had not existed in previous assemblies. Seats for representatives of the non-noble territories, the communities without formal noble affiliation that comprised the majority of the population and had, in previous assemblies, been represented by the noble houses that held their territories, rather than by anyone who had actually come from them. Raiden had ordered those seats built. The noble houses had objected through formal channels and informal ones. He had noted the objections and proceeded with the construction. He stood at the center of the assembly hall, and he did not use the throne. The throne was at the hall's head, where it had always been, and it was empty. And he stood in the center of the floor where everyone in the hall could see him without the elevation that the throne provided, which was a choice whose symbolism was not lost on anyone in the room. He spoke for 40 minutes. He did not use the formal address register of Nocturne assembly tradition. He used the register he used in direct conversation, clear, without performance, with the specific quality of someone who had decided that the most important thing a statement could be was true and was building everything else around that constraint. He described what had happened. Not the version that had been managed through official channels in the weeks since the battle, but the version that included the 11 years of internal rot, the specific mechanisms through which the palace's security had been compromised, the names that had since been confirmed through the accountability process, and the decisions he had made that had contributed to the conditions in which those mechanisms could operate. He did not perform regret. He did not ask for understanding. He stated what had happened and what his contribution to it had been, and what the accountability process had produced, and what he believed the changes to the assembly structure and function needed to be to prevent the same mechanics from reproducing themselves. And then he said the thing that the assembly had been waiting for without knowing it was waiting for it. I have spent my reign believing that dominance was loyalty, he said, that if I was strong enough and present enough and capable enough, the people around me would be reliable because the alternative to reliability was my strength. That fear of consequences was the same thing as genuine commitment. He looked at the floor for one moment, not in shame, but in the way of someone choosing their words. I was wrong in a way that nearly destroyed everything I built. Not because the enemies outside were strong enough to destroy it, because I had confused the removal of visible opposition with the presence of actual trust, and those two things are not the same. And the gap between them is where the rot lives. The assembly was silent. What saved this kingdom, he said, was not my strength. It was a woman who walked into this palace in chains and had more operational knowledge of its infrastructure after 11 months of patient work than anyone who had spent years here with full authority. She saved it not through power, but through the specific quality of a person who understood completely that being underestimated was not a disadvantage to overcome. It was a resource to use. He looked at Celine where she stood at the hall's east side, which was not the position of a person being honored. It was the position of a person who had arrived early and assessed the room and chosen the location that gave her the best sightlines, and had then stayed there because it was the correct position. He looked at her. She looked back. I am proposing to this assembly, he said, a formal restructuring of the throne's authority that includes a co-equal advisory position with full operational access to military intelligence, security infrastructure, and royal decision-making processes at every level. Not a symbolic position, a functional one, with genuine authority and genuine accountability. He paused. I am further proposing that the person who holds that position be confirmed by this assembly rather than appointed by me, because positions that exist by the will of one person are positions whose authority dissolves when that one person's interests change, and I have spent the last 40 days understanding what that costs. E.g., the assembly began to produce the particular sound of a large group of people processing something that had moved significantly outside the boundaries of what they expected. Raiden looked at Celine, he said, across the hall, in a register that was not quite public address and not quite private conversation. This is what I can offer, not what you're owed, what I can actually give. She picked up the notebook. She wrote. She held it up where he could see it from across the hall. It said, I know the difference. He held her gaze. He nodded once. The confirmation vote was not unanimous. She had not expected it to be. The noble houses that had the most to lose from genuine accountability were also the houses with the most assembly votes, and the restructuring that Raiden had proposed threatened the specific configuration of influence that they had spent generations building, and the fact that several of their number had just been through formal accountability proceedings made the threat not abstract but viscerally immediate. The vote was sufficient, not comfortable, but sufficient. The non-noble representatives occupying their new seats with the careful attention of people who understood they were in a room where they were not supposed to have a voice and had just been given one, voted in a block. The military command voted with them, which was a development that Torvek had personally managed in the 3 days before the assembly, and which Dawson had facilitated through channels that were technically outside proper process, and which Raiden had chosen not to examine too closely. It passed. She stood in the assembly hall after the hall had emptied and held the formal document of her appointment, which was written in the official Noctaron register, and used her full name, Celine Ashcroft, Co-Equal Advisory Authority, confirmed by the Grand Assembly of Noctera, and she looked at it with the particular quality of attention she brought to things that contained a gap between what they said and what they were. What the document said was authority. What it was the outcome of a decision she had made in the corridor of a burning palace in the middle of a night she had not planned for, to hand a piece of paper to a man she had known for 9 days and trust that what she read in his face was what was actually there. She had been right. She did not make a habit of tracking the ratio of correct to incorrect assessments. The exercise was not useful because the cost of the incorrect ones was not reducible by knowing the ratio, but she registered this one. Raiden found her in the empty hall. He stood beside her and looked at the document she was holding and did not say anything for a moment, which was something she had come to understand about him in the weeks since the battle. He did not fill silence with sound when the silence was doing necessary work. It was one of the things that made him functional to operate alongside. "I want to ask you something," he said. She looked at him. "The 2 words," he said, "in the gallery. When I asked why you showed your hand." She waited. "Because you," he said. "I've been carrying a second interpretation of that for 40 days, and I want to know if I'm wrong." She looked at him for a long moment. She took the notebook from her hem. She had been carrying it since the 9th day. The spine was cracked from the night she had thrown it at the wall in the council corridor. Some of the pages were damaged from the rain that had come through the East Tower's broken window during the battle's 2nd hour. It was not a clean document. It was a document that had been through something. She wrote. She held it up. It said, "You're not wrong." He read it. He looked at her above the edge of the paper with the expression she had first seen in the gallery on the 6th day. The one she had filed for later examination because she did not have a category for it at the time. She had a category for it now. She had developed it across 40 days of evidence. It was the look of a man who had spent 15 years being exactly as strong as the situation required, and had just been given, for the first time in a very long time, permission to be something other than what the situation required. He reached out. He put his hand over hers where she was holding the notebook. She did not move. She looked down at his hand over hers, and then up at his face, and she thought about the first day in the auction square. The weight of 100 gold pieces representing a life that everyone in that square believed they understood, and the long distance between that day and this hall, and everything that had been built in the space between them. She had not built it for him. She had built it for her own reasons, which were older and colder and had to do with 43 names in a valley and the specific, absolute commitment of a commander to the people who had trusted her with their lives. But what she had built had made room for this. That was not something she had planned. It was something better. Noctera rebuilt across the following year, not in the way that empires rebuilt after conflict, not through the suppression of the conflict's memory and the aggressive resumption of the status quo. It rebuilt through the harder and slower process of actually addressing what the conflict had revealed. The treasury shortfalls were publicly accounted for and their sources identified, and the mechanisms that had enabled them were dismantled and replaced with processes that were less elegant and more resistant to the specific kind of pressure that had corrupted the previous ones. The border security infrastructure was restructured under a command arrangement that distributed intelligence access and removed the single-point vulnerabilities that Sorn had exploited. The noble houses that had survived the accountability process intact adjusted their operations with the particular care of institutions that had watched their peers go through public proceedings and understood that the era of managed opacity was over. The Shadow Fang remained in the city, not as a palace force, not as a Nocturne auxiliary, as what it had always been, an independent operational entity with its own command structure and its own doctrine and its own code of conduct, operating in coordination with the royal military under the terms that had been written in a cracked notebook in the corridor of a burning palace and confirmed in the Grand Assembly 3 months later. Celine worked from the East Tower. She worked the way she had always worked, from complete information assembled through the stone architecture and the human network and the patient accumulation of what careful observation produced. She sat in the early mornings with the maps and the dispatches and the intelligence reports, and she worked through them with the same unhurried precision that had characterized everything she did, and she produced from them the assessments that informed every major decision the throne made in the year that followed. Raiden read every one. He did not always agree. He told her when he didn't, in the direct, friction-free way that was his natural register, and she wrote back in the equally direct way that was hers. And the disagreements were occasionally extended and occasionally heated, and always, at the end of them, productive. They produced better decisions than either of them would have made alone. This was not a romantic claim. It was a measurable fact about the outcomes, which she tracked because she tracked everything. And the outcomes were better. And the reason they were better was the same reason the Battle of the Ashen Plains had gone the way it went. Compatible intelligence, no lag between the knowing and the doing. She thought about this on a morning in the early spring of the following year, standing at the East Tower window with the dispatches in her hand and the mountain range visible to the north under a sky that was beginning to show the first real warmth of the season. She had come to this palace in chains. She had come with a specific objective and a specific timeline and a specific plan, and the plan had been dismantled in the council corridor by a man she thought was dead, and the objective had been achieved in a form she had not designed, and the timeline had been replaced by events that operated on no one's schedule. She had come to this palace intending to leave it. She was still here, not because she had been held, because the things she had built inside these walls, the operational structure, the accountability framework, the particular working arrangement that had emerged from a night of shared necessity, had produced something she had not had a category for when she arrived. She had a category for it now. It was called home. Not the home of belonging to a place or to a structure of authority that claimed her. The home of having made something with real people and real cost and the full weight of genuine choice that was worth the making. She heard footsteps on the tower stairs. Raiden's. She knew them by now across every surface this palace contained. And she set the dispatches on the table and turned. He came through the door with a cup in each hand and the expression of a man who has been up since before the morning watch and has reached the point in a long working day where the next task and the next cup of strong black tea have become the same thought. He held one out. She took it. They stood at the window together in the early light and looked at the mountains and drank the tea that was too hot but was exactly what the morning required, and neither of them said anything because neither of them needed to, and the silence was the kind that was not empty but full of everything they had built, and everything it had cost, and everything it was still becoming. Outside, the ashen plains were green. The winter was over. Below the tower, the palace was waking into its morning, guards cycling through rotations, servants crossing the courtyard with the tools of the day's work. The ordinary machinery of a place that had been through something and had come out of it, changed in ways that were not yet fully visible but were real and permanent, and had been paid for with the specific currency of human decision made under genuine pressure. Celine looked at the mountains. She thought about the 43 names. She thought about the valley she could not return to in its old form. She thought about what it meant that she had built something here, in the palace of the man who had purchased her at a public auction in a market square, that those 43 people would have recognized as worth the building, not as compensation for what they had lost. Nothing compensated for that, but as the thing their sacrifice had made possible, not through design, not through anyone's intention, but through the specific alchemy of people choosing, again and again, to do the harder thing rather than the easier one. The harder thing was not always heroic. Often it was not. Often it was simply staying in the room when leaving was available, pressing the stone again when the signal came back unclear, writing 2 words on a piece of paper and holding it up and trusting that the person reading them was what they appeared to be. It was not strength that had saved this kingdom. It was the accumulation of small, unglamorous decisions made by people who were tired and uncertain and operating on incomplete information, who chose to remain present to the task in front of them rather than retreating to the safety of what they already knew. It was the woman everyone underestimated. It was the king who learned, late and at considerable cost, that the thing he thought he was building was only the scaffolding for the thing he was actually capable of. It was the silence that had always known exactly what it was doing. Raiden looked at her. She looked back. Outside, Noctara was waking, and the woman who had arrived in chains held her tea in both hands and breathed the cold morning air of a kingdom that was, against every reasonable probability, still standing, and felt, in the deep and unperformable way that only real things can be felt, that it was hers, not as a possession, as a choice, made every morning, remade every day. That was the empire worth building. That was the only one that lasted.